Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It is February 4th. This is Senate Education Committee. Before we start, just a little housekeeping. It is the request of Ledge Council when during our breaks, even though it might seem like a good time to converse with somebody who is online, those are actually times that we need to mute as well as get off of video altogether. So those conversations are captured, and I think multiple committees now have had just different people having conversations during that time about a range of things. Many of them just perfectly fine, but that's not something that Ledge Council is wanting folks to do. So just a reminder, when we take a break, mute and get off video. Terrific, welcome. Today we are starting off with a familiar face to many, Allie Richards, who is the director of Let's Grow Kids here in the state of Vermont. Allie is here to do a number of things, two things really. First and foremost, she's been invited in to give us an overview of Let's Grow Kids, their work, some of their goals and initiatives moving forward with regard to the 0 to 5 in particular age group. Additionally, I asked her to weigh in a little bit. We heard some preliminary testimony yesterday from Secretary French on the governor's proposal for early childhood. As Secretary French said, these are early days. There's nothing really for us to do at this point. But just to keep that conversation going, I've asked Ms. Richards to weigh in on that. We are then, after that, going to hear some additional testimony on our draft committee bill on literacy. We'll then move to close the day by having hopefully a good committee discussion around starting with VSAC's proposal for scholarship funding of students who are going to CCV and coming from households with combined incomes of less than $50,000 or less. We'll have a committee discussion on that and try to put some things down and build a bill as it relates to what we might want to do with post-secondary education opportunities. And then finally, I have a new draft of S16 that I will email everyone so everyone has an opportunity to look at it this evening. That is the bill that is looking at school disciplinary issues. And we will pick that back up tomorrow and continue with our markup and adjustments to that. So, Ms. Richards, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
It's such a pleasure. For the record, Allie Richards, CEO of Let's Grow Kids, and I really appreciate that introduction, Chair Campion, and it's really great to see some familiar faces and some new faces to me, and have always so enjoyed working with this committee, and it's been a while since I've been here, so it really, really appreciate it, and I'll do exactly what the chair laid out. I did submit a document. I just want to sort of say that's more of a reference document for those who have some questions. I'll lightly follow it, but that is in your files if you need to refer back to it. Because there are some new members, I will go into light detail about the child care system for shared context, but that's also repeated in the document I submitted for testimony as well. So thank you for that opportunity. So I will dive right in. Let's Grow Kids. We are an organization on a mission, a high quality, affordable early childhood education for all who need it 0 to 5 by 2025. And we do mean that. We are going out of business by 2025. We are a 501c3 affiliated with the Vermont Community Foundation. Primarily, we are philanthropically driven. And although we do partner with the state and have for years and years on a variety of programs related to 0 to 5. And we really tackle this mission, which is huge, but also narrow, in two key ways. We're on the ground with early educators, helping to build capacity today for kids and families, supporting early educators. And while we're doing that, we're identifying bright spots and gaps and policy recommendations, creating economies of scale, some business supports and other things like that, that really inform the policy, which is our second key thing that we work on at Let's Grow Kids. Public policy change and public investment, which is really the only solution to fully fixing a 0 to 5 affordable, accessible, equitable high quality 0 to 5 system. So that's who Let's Grow Kids is. We have over 25,000 Vermonters from all walks of life and sectors who are actively engaged in this movement. And we have sort of a load of super champions, again, from all sectors: healthcare, business, education, obviously the 0 to 5 realm, parents, grandparents that are very actively involved in this movement and have been for years. So a quick overview about childcare, for those who haven't spent as much time in this space. I think it's just really important to note, why does Let's Grow Kids exist? Why are we talking about 0 to 5? I think it's clear now. It's really in the public discourse more than it's ever been before. Many of you, live and breathe this, so I know this will be repetitive for many, but it's this idea that actually so much about your health and your ability to learn and have healthy relationships and be successful in the world in all dimensions, critical thinking to stable relationships with others, it really forms between 0 and 5. It is such a crucial transformative time in your life. And we know through deep, sort of unequivocal science and research that when you experience high quality learning opportunities, nurturing, stimulating opportunities and relationships during this time, you are so much more likely to sort of succeed in all of these dimensions. And when you don't and receive sort of toxic stress or unfortunately are sort of, experiencing things on the other side of the spectrum, adverse child experiences, it really, really does start creating these achievement gaps that you all spend a lot of time thinking about, especially in this committee. It's well beyond the education dimension as well, but that's a huge piece of it. I know literacy is something you're paying close attention to. If you think about these literacy numbers and you looked up the pipeline, 0 to 5 is when you're really setting the stage for these children to be able to then hit all of these markers throughout their lives, including the 3rd grade reading score as one example. So how is 0 to 5 set up today in Vermont? Really, there's 2 key sections. One is there's center-based, so that could be a for-profit, a nonprofit, or a school-based. And then there's home-based, so family childcare homes, where literally mostly women open up a business out of their homes. They usually care for 4 to 10 children. They can hire staff and get licensed instead of just registered, and then they can have more children in their care. And there's also, they can take after school children in all of these different types of programs as well. Now, many of these programs, school-based and center-based and family childcare homes, are pre-K providers. So through Act 1266 that many of you were a part of and know, the universal pre-K law in Vermont, you just have to be a pre-qualified pre-K provider. You meet certain requirements, and then you can offer public pre-K to the 3 and 4-year-olds in your care in any of these settings. And many, many of these different programs do offer this. This is what's called a mixed delivery system. It's incredibly important. You actually heard Secretary French talk about it yesterday a bit, which I'll get to as well. But it's this idea, and it's best practice in this country for 0 to 5, meets more responsive to the needs of communities and families, or the rural nature, also developmental needs that differ greatly child to child. So that's the mixed delivery system. And that means you have certain standards, you have certain funding, you have pre-K, but you can be a center, a school-based or home-based program and still be in this system. So that's how we're set up today, and how it interacts a bit with education, the education fund through the pre-K law especially. So that's a little overview now. I'm happy to take questions at any point or later. And again, it's in my notes. I just want to move quickly then to pre-pandemic. What was the situation? So pre-pandemic, this is the structure of our 0 to 5 system, but I hate to share, the very sort of bad status quo news that 3 out of 5 kids under 6 in Vermont, did not have access to the childcare that they needed. 3 out of 5. So they weren't able to access the system for a variety of reasons. One is because we just simply do not have enough of it. Okay, there's not enough for a variety of reasons. It's very difficult to do this in the current construct that we have today, mostly through funding. So we know that there's about 2,000 early educators that are needed to meet the real demand for Vermont children. 2,000 additional from where we are today. And the average wage of an early educator is about $13 an hour without benefits. That's about half of what a kindergarten teacher makes. So you're starting to see there's some real issues here about perverse incentives in the system, the way it interacts with the K through 12 system, and our inability to really have a fully sustainable funded 0 to 5 system that really is able to pay for high quality, pay for wages for early educators, and be affordable for families. That's the final factor. So there's simply not enough of it, and families are actually paying, you probably hear from many of your constituents, 30% of their household income on childcare, right? That's the situation today. I want to quickly just mention outcomes. You all focus on outcomes, so rightly so, and we do as well. It's not enough just to fix a system, to push money into it. What we're after is improving outcomes for children as the bottom line. And we also know from there are all these other impacts that happen when you get 0 to 5 right. Family supports, saving money down the road on special ed, on healthcare costs, depressurizing the system, bringing folks into the state, right? Workforce development, there's a huge sort of web of what happens, but really specifically, there are childhood outcomes that you focus on.
One moment, sorry. Senator Hooker has her hand up, so I just want to make sure whatever her question is, it's timely.
Yeah, thank you. Before you get too far down, Allie, you mentioned that 3 out of 5 kids pre-pandemic did not have access to the child care that they needed. Did they have access to any? How much of that was, part of, they had some child care, but not sufficient? Do you have those numbers broken out?
That's such a good question, Senator Hooker. So a few ways to look at it. So we do what's called the Stalled at the Start study, and I'm happy to share that with you all. It's actually broken down by county if you haven't seen it too, which basically our methodology was for the 3 to 5. 3 out of 5, we've basically found that 7 out of 10 kids in Vermont had all available parents in the workforce. They needed some form of out-of-home care. And we were only meeting the need of 3 out of 5 of those kids. And so what we have found is we work very closely in communities. So we anecdotally and through data, sort of drill down on these numbers. And one thing that we have found is many sort of fall through the cracks. So they are on wait lists for years until it's a moot point, and they will divide shifts between parents. They never ever see each other during the day, which is also a very bad outcome for the family. And sometimes they rely on grandparents. Sometimes that's a choice, and sometimes it's not. Or a lot of folks will drop out of the workforce. So this is sort of the anecdote to back up those numbers. The other thing is that we did a supply and demand survey with the University of Chicago in partnership with the legislature a few years ago. And we found that 1,400 Vermonters, and most of them were educated females, were not in a job that they either had or they had lined up because they couldn't find childcare. So what we have found is we're never making an argument about preference. We're never making an argument about what's best for a family. What we have found through years of really tilling the ground on this issue is that Vermont families have 0 choices. And in many cases, they would choose to have a stable, high quality childcare environment in one of these settings if it was accessible to them. Does that get at a bit of it? So great. And I will say the pandemic exacerbated all of these things, as you well know. And there's some wonderful, news, which is the state really, really committed to this 0 to 5 industry over the pandemic. And through federal supports, we have lost so little childcare through this terrible crisis than every other state. So we're in a really much stronger position to fix these systemic issues together and leap from here, because we've preserved the status quo, which has been a really important, and it's worth noting, really we've led the country in this. Anything else before I go on?
May I just ask a quick question before you go on? You mentioned that, it's a mixed delivery system out there. So I just want to pause and just give us a sense. So again, you might have a hospital setting, a hospital might offer the program, a school perhaps offers a program, and then you have somebody, in their home that also might offer a program. Are those the kinds of things out there?
Yeah, exactly. Someone will open it in their home for the home-based care, right? And that's a business in their home, and that's part of the regulated system. Some might be a school-based program, and those are the pre-K only programs. So they're offering pre-K to 3 and 4-year-olds. And then there will be these
pre-K, just for our definition, it is just 3 to 4-year-olds.
So the publicly funded pre-K, I'm glad you asked, and this is where the stuff gets tricky. And this can be a longer conversation another time too, but the summary is Act 166 is our universal pre-K law. It's 10 hours of publicly funded pre-K for any 3 or 4-year-old who needs it. Now, I'm happy to report, I think last I checked, it was about 75 to 78% of all 3 and 4-year-olds in Vermont were accessing this 10 hours of publicly funded pre-K. So as far as that supply and demand number I mentioned, by the way, Act 166 proves the point. When you fund the system, when you put quality standards in the system, actually you start meeting the supply and demand, the market drives that, and kids are getting what they need, and it's higher quality. So the quality has really lifted because of that bill, and as has the access. Now, again, it's really important to note it's only 10 hours a week. And Senator Campion, that comes from the Education Fund. So the Education Fund says we're going to fund K through 12, and we're also going to fund 10 hours of 3 and 4-year-olds. Now, because it's the mixed delivery system, that's what I mentioned earlier. A private center could be for-profit or nonprofit in the way they set up their business structure. So let's take, the YMCA. The YMCA is our largest nonprofit childcare provider in the state, and they offer high quality programming for 0 to 5-year-olds because they meet the qualifications for pre-K. They have a licensed teacher for a certain amount of hours. They're 4 and 5 stars on the quality level and other things like that. They qualify for pre-K with the Agency of Education. And so they can offer free pre-K for the 3 and 4-year-olds in their care for 10 hours a week, nested in the rest of the school day, the rest of the school year, and the rest of the ages 0 to 3 as well. Does that make sense? It's like kind of like, think about the 10 hours of pre-K as a law and funding that like hook into the mixed delivery system of 0 to 5 that can be in any of these settings.
Sure. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's an important interplay. I'm glad that you've all seized upon it. It's a very important interplay, especially as we think about how to move the system forward. But I will just add, it was an infusion of funding, and it did exactly what we expected, what we've seen in other places, and what we hoped for. Kids are getting access to publicly funded pre-K in high numbers and saturation type level numbers. Because remember, this is not compulsory. All of this is voluntary.
When I was in the legislature when we took that step, and I do remember a couple of years later, and maybe Senator Perchlik might have more information on this. He was on this committee last year. In one of the updates, I remember hearing that, the families that are taking advantage of those 10 hours are families that tend to maybe not need it as much as low-income Vermonters. And low-income Vermonters aren't really taking advantage of the pre-K because 10 hours is okay, but 10 hours doesn't allow them to go to work or, do complete other commitments, if you will. And so I'm just keeping that. First, I'm wondering if that has changed at all. And then secondly, we just don't want to make that mistake, of course, with how we're offering 0 to 5. Not that it was a mistake. You know what I'm talking about.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yes, very, very clearly. I'm happy to have Senators Perchlik or Lyons or anyone else, if you want to weigh in on this. My opinion would be, Senator, that there was no data for a while. So we were all grappling with terrible anecdote, and it was basically, it depended on what pre-K program you're talking about in what region. And then we finally got some data, and the data actually is not too bad on the free and reduced lunch. If you're using that
Right.
as your guidelines, there's actually some really nice access data across free reduced lunch for pre-K. And we're also at the level, like in Oklahoma, for example, they've had pre-K forever, which sometimes surprises folks. And they are about an 80% take-up rate. And we're, between 75 and 78%. It's only been a few years. So now about the access, you're absolutely right. Transportation is always an issue. We've been very, sort of following and concerned about with other partners in this and other barriers like that. But the mixed delivery system is what is the key to get through those things. In other words, someone can take advantage of these 10 hours only of free public, high quality education in the Y, for example, and the child never needs to know. There's a seamless day from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. The parents get that 10-hour, a week back in their tuition, and they're receiving the quality care, and there's no transitions for them. So that's why the mixed delivery system, it's really important. It breaks down a lot of those barriers.
Senator Hooker.
Thank you. Allie, you answered one of the questions I had was, are parents able to use this as part of, their continuum of care for their kids? And secondly, parent-child centers, are they the centers that you talk about? Is that what we're talking about here?
So there are, I believe, 14 parent-child centers around the state of Vermont, and they are highly specialized expert units, I'll say. They do a variety of things. I believe they have like 8 principles that involves sort of children's integrated services and reach up, and some involve Medicaid. There's a lot of there are a lot of targeted services that parent-child centers provide for families that are in most needs, wraparound services, really high quality work. They also provide childcare. Many of them, not all of them, provide childcare on site as a part of their programming. So for example, my backyard is the Washington County Parent-Child Center. They have a robust 0 to 5 childcare program on site, as well as all these other things that they offer. And there, I believe others have, for example, just have one small infant room to sort of meet a very niche need that they know in their community. So there's a variety, but they do offer pre-K. But what I guess a way of looking at this, Senator Hooker, is what we have are thousands of early childhood programs around Vermont. The PCCs are some of that, are 14 of them. The school-based are some of them through these pre-K programs. The home-based are others. We have hundreds, of home-based programs all over the state. And then we have these center-based, and that's sort of example. The Y is one. It depends on where you, let's see, I believe so. Annette's preschool is one in Heinsberg, and there's, lots of programs like that are for-profit or nonprofit. Those are the centers we're talking about. And what we're trying to sort of say is you need high quality, 0 to 5 across the board. And what we're sort of saying is you need parent-child center quality with these wraparound services, family engagement, and this very high quality for everyone in the 0 to 5 space. And that's what I'll move to our goals in our policy proposal at the end, which I'm nearly at actually, if you're doing time management. And that's what we're trying to get at, is this sense of, look, it's really difficult to be a childcare center, a childcare program right now, because think about, how do we pay for it? It's not like the K through 12 system. It would be as if we were all lived in a community and said, let's all pitch in and open up a school that we fund ourselves. It would be astronomically expensive. And so today, the way that we fund 0 to 5 is a little bit of this very important pre-K funding for 10 hours a week for only 3 and 4-year-olds. That mixes with the 0 to 5 system. A little bit of state and federal funding through child care financial assistance and Head Start and others, some federal, CCDBG grant, things like that. Then parents pay well more than they can afford, and early educators pay by taking it on their backs, by not actually getting paid a wage, by not having benefits, by not being able to do all the services they know their families need. So something's got to give. That's why, with the high quality 0 to 5 model, that's best practice in this country. It's a mixed delivery system, and it is funded in a way that is affordable for families and allows folks to make a comparable wage based on their credentials to professionals in similar fields, and have benefits, and be able to actually meet the quality and the whole family support. Does that make sense for an overview?
Yes.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, so I'll just zip through the rest so we can open up for conversation. I just want to touch upon the governor's proposal, Senator, if that works, and give you all the high level goals of our plan. So I was mentioning outcomes. You mentioned free reduced lunch sort of equity pieces, Senator. So I just want to touch upon that. So glad you all pay so much attention to this. This again is deeply an equity issue, because what we know through clear data, common sense, and others, you all well have probably seen as you've gone through life, that these deep structural inequities, racial or socioeconomic or otherwise, absolutely are mitigated by giving every child a strong start at this transformative time in their development. It is a true strategy for breaking through generational poverty and other inequities. And so we have actually, if you look at kindergarten readiness, this past year we had 84% of Vermont children were considered kindergarten ready based on our kindergarten ready study in Vermont. That's wonderful, actually. There's a very high number, but there are inequities even if you dig deeply into that number. For example, 76% of children eligible for free and reduced lunch were kindergarten ready in that cohort, based on 89% of their peers with higher incomes. So absolutely, there are inequities. We've seen the power of high quality 0 to 5 ubiquitously for the population to really sort of combat these needs. And then you start seeing these numbers really escalate into literacy and other very troubling trends that you all are looking at too. So this is to get to the root of this cause and give all these kids from all backgrounds what they need in a way that is supportive to them and to their particular needs and their family needs. So solutions, we do have some. We've been working for years on what does this look like? How does this all interact? What does equity look like? What does access and affordability look like? And so we actually have a bill, and it has a number. It was introduced in the House with 95 tripartisan sponsors, and it will be in committee, starting in relevant committees next week. And so many of you have been involved in this, and I'm very excited for it to hit your chamber. And it basically lays out a few, so I'll just do the quick overview, because I know we'll have, I hope, much time to talk in the details later on in the process. But it does 6 key things. It makes early childhood education more affordable for families, so that no family spends more than 10% of their gross household income on childcare. So it basically says, this is our goal as a state. Let's put the goal in statute, because this is the thing that is bottlenecking quality access and affordability for our kids in Vermont. The other thing that's bottlenecking it is fair compensation for the early educators doing this crucial work. So fairly compensating and advance the early childhood profession. And those are the 2 key goals. They are the things that really are bottlenecking us in Vermont, and we have to fix them. So you legislate those 2 goals. That's what's in the bill right now. Then you take some steps right now to continue to build the system. So expand access to high quality early childhood education, continue to do capacity building work through incremental increases in childcare financial assistance to expand eligibility and other pieces like that, and also continue to do capacity building grants. I'm going to pause on this for 1 second. Something that you may not know that Let's Grow Kids does, as I mentioned, we're on the ground doing programmatic work. We've actually, with philanthropic dollars, matching state dollars for the past few years, we've helped create over 2,000 new high quality early childhood spaces in all settings, doing this work together, building the system, getting it ready for state investment to really fly. So that's been a big part of our work, and it's been in conjunction with the state and the legislature. So that's just a nod to what that sort of continue that work on the ground together through one-time funds this year. Also, invest in the new IT system for our early education system. It sounds so silly compared to this vision we're trying to paint for all of our kids and our future in Vermont, but it all builds on an IT system. That's for parents, that's for programs, and that's for the state. We need data, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be streamlined, we need to understand what's out there, parents need to be able to pick their childcare programs, all of that. The payment based on income, all of that is predicated on this IT system. And then finally, 2 key reports and studies that are in this bill. One is strengthen the early childhood education system, governance and administration. So really, really kick the tires on that. And finally, investment. Identify a long-term and sustainable funding source that will actually allow us to have a 0 to 5 system. So that's the goals. Thank you for allowing me to sort of preview that with you all. And it does actually dovetail beautifully with my reaction to the administration's proposals, which is just a very short piece. And again, then we can maybe just dig into any more details as you all would like. Basically, it's very reassuring that the governor continues to prioritize 0 to 5. As you heard in his inaugural address this year, as you've heard in years past, he has actually, along with the legislature, committed to a 5-year redesign plan, which you may be familiar with. And that's great news because it really shows a shared commitment on this issue. So basically, the way I would say that started in 2019 and we're in year 3 of this 5-year redesign. So in the governor's budget, you'll actually see money for the IT system I mentioned, as well as an increase in childcare financial assistance, which is part of these steps we're taking together to keep building the system while we identify the sustainable funding. And that's all in the budget. So that's very good that we're all sort of aligned in this way. Specifically, there's a tax credit that I think you all probably talked about yesterday with Secretary French. And that's a very positive thing. We're incredibly eager to hear more details because all the time we hear from programs that property taxes are a burden, especially from nonprofit childcare programs. So we're eager to learn more details, but that sounds like an incredibly positive proposal and a step forward that we would support. And then you also heard discussion about moving the childcare development division and the systems and pieces of the puzzle covered by that division, and restructuring those into the Agency of Education and into other areas of the Agency of Human Services, like the Health Department. Again, we are open to any good idea that improves the lives of kids. So we're very, very eager to understand this proposal more, to hear more details of what it would look like. But there are some key principles that we would really urge you all to keep in mind. Now, this is part of the governor's cradle to career discussion, which I know you heard from Secretary French. And, there are some great things about that include a continuum of education and data, and really supporting early educators to be a part of this cradle to career education system. So there are certainly merits in that regard. I will say that any proposal like this, we just urge there to be the right amount of time and process and analysis, so that is done properly, or it is deemed, not the right thing for the child. So just an analysis that actually gets to the bottom of whether this is going to improve the lives of kids, that keeps that child well-being in the center, and that really hears from the folks that have been doing this work on the ground, the ones that interact with these systems, so they can really allow us to weigh those elements of any governance change like this. So I will say it dovetails nicely with our proposal, because in our bill, in the bill, and I use our, like the big our, the movement's bill, the legislative sort of champions bill, it states that feasibility study on governance administration that I mentioned, this is the perfect venue to talk about this. I think we should all take any good and new idea very, very seriously, give it its due process, and really understand what the details are and how it will play out in the field. But again, I have to reiterate, keeping the child at the center and really, truly listening to the folks on the ground doing the work. So that's a basic, thumbs up on hearing more, and very positive on the property tax exemption piece. And so I'm excited to hear you all continue to dig into that. And again, all ears with due process to really deeply consider the CDD to AOE move.
Okay. Senator Lyons.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Allie. And as most people don't know, I work very hard with DCF to put the bill together, the child care bill together. Then the decision was made, who would introduce it first? So it's currently in the House, and I know that House Human Services will begin working on it. This is a continuum of effort that we've had over time, as Allie said, and I would really appreciate the input that Let's Grow Kids has had, in particular establishing some goals. I do, I guess, as you're talking and looking at your testimony, it's really clear to me that there's a distinction between early childhood education, which is 3 to 4 in our world, and then early child care, including the stuff that we see in parent-child centers and other areas. And just to let folks know that as we're looking at, as our committee in Health and Welfare is looking at this, we've been working, I think there's parallel worlds here. We've been working to fully integrate early child care with home visiting and other healthcare opportunities for a continuum of care in our healthcare reform. So this is an important dialogue to have, but for me, and I agree with Allie 100%, it's the measurable outcomes that we see, the standards that are in place at each stage, and each stage, of course, is different. So thank you for your testimony, and I know we'll be seeing you again here or there.
I hope so. If I may, Chair, I'd love just to quickly respond to something Senator Lyons said about the distinction. I think I'm making more of a distinction about the money flow on pre-K with 3 and 4s, and I think that's really important. I think you'll even see in my testimony, I don't think I pointed this out, that we call it child care. This is the term of art. This is a term of phrase that folks, like it actually was daycare. Now we've really, these are professionals that care for children, not days. I think that there was a lot of from the field saying this doesn't really respect what we do. So there's been a move towards childcare. I will say the field is starting to call this early childhood education, which is absolutely the right way to start talking about this, because what we're saying is it's early care and learning is another way to put it.
Right.
I think what's really important for us to understand is there is a wraparound sort of holistic need here. It's the child's full need, and the family's full needs. There are care components and there are learning components, which the COVID has really shown us that's true in K through 12 too. So in other words, there are care and learning needs that we should be very just like understanding of and transparent about, that meets the child and the whole family in all of these settings.
Senator Perschler.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for your testimony, Ms. Richards. It's always great to see your enthusiasm and hard work and heart and soul that you put into the care and learning of our children. The couple of questions I had, and maybe this isn't really a question for you, but for the administration, but is your understanding on the tax credit, and maybe if instead of just answering what the administration is proposing of what Let's Grow Kids would like, I was unclear of whether they were proposing just the centers or any childcare facility. So that would, I took it to mean that it included the home-based childcare. But somebody else said, no, they thought it was just the centers. So I didn't know if you had answer to that in a position from Let's Grow Kids.
I don't want to misspeak, so I think I have to get back to you, Senator. The way I've heard it said is property tax exemption from the property tax for private child care programs. So in that case, that's likely expansive to all if it is a blanket. And again, we've really heard from nonprofit private centers that this is a pinch. So hopefully it does get at that need, but I can follow up with more information.
Okay, because I was assuming you would support if it did include home-based.
Absolutely. Yes. These are businesses that happen to be run out of homes. And so there's discussion of that. I think that was even floated specifically, by itself in years past. And there was discussion about divvying up square footage of a home, you know what I mean? And doing exemption of property tax on the portion that was the business. So there's been a lot of discussion on the details of this in previous years, but yes, any support you can give to an industry that really needs funding at its core is helpful.
Okay, and then on the overall proposal of the reorg of, early education or early care and learning, it sounded like you were, being, careful in your wording on how you addressed it. But what it would be interesting to hear is, I don't want to call it a counter proposal, because I know you're not saying you're against what the administration is saying, but I hear you about, we need analysis and time, but it seems, I worry we don't really have a lot of time, but it would be great to have a proposal from, I don't want to say it's sides, but your side of things, or from the professionals in the childcare sector saying, this is the way we think it should be organized. We deal with the different programs. We have these two masters, so to speak, because we have this circle of care. They often deal with both Agency of Education and DCF every day, and it's a problem from the child care providers that I talk to. They don't like it. So it'd be great if they had a proposal back to us saying, this is the way we think it should be organized from us on the ground, if you know what I mean.
That's a great point and suggestion. And I will say there's actually a lot of material that I'd be happy to share that has sort of happened in that vein. A lot of what we have done at Let's Grow Kids is channel kind of coalition and consensus-based work. And one of those things is the Blue Ribbon Commission on Financing High Quality Affordable Childcare. That was a large group of folks that was involved in that work from lots of different sectors, including on the ground. And it led to some of the key principles, like what does affordability really mean in Vermont? What does access mean? What does quality mean? And so we really adopted those as sort of a facilitator, an empty vessel for the movement here. And really, because that was really good work done by a lot of folks. Then that led to an appreciative inquiry summit that the Building Bright Futures our partners in Building Bright Futures hosted, with over 1,000 Vermonters involved from all walks of life, sort of weighing in on their needs for the system. That led to a smaller group doing a think tank. So just to give you a little sense, there's been an evolution that this kind of question has been touched upon in those, which is really like we've all really been coalescing as a community around that work over the years. So we could send you some of those reports if helpful. We have in our white paper that goes sort of as a companion with this, a lot of this actually analysis is done. So maybe I'd start by sending that to the committee, which it looks at best practice around governance. This has been very well studied, and no, I want to be clear, no state has holistically done a fully funded 0 to 5 system, but some regions have gotten pieces of it right. Some cities have gotten pieces of it right. So we're learning from all of that. And that's sort of in our proposal. It has some best practices based on all of that. And from the field actually has been quite vocal in our work and in developing the policy proposal that we put together. And I think, they would say there's some real deficits in the way it is done right now. I think a lot of people will agree with that. And there's some real assets. And so that's what you want to balance when looking at any possible restructuring. So just a little bit, I guess I'm giving you more context and possible future reading than a full concrete answer, because it's kind of complicated.
Yeah, I know, understood. Thank you.
Great.
Ms. Richards, would you define as best you can high quality for us? And I may have missed it, and I apologize if we've already covered it, but financing is one thing, but how do we say, this is high quality and this might not be?
I love that question. So there's a couple of ways to do that. And one is to say the Blue Ribbon Commission actually said, here's what we're going to say is high quality. And it was basically a hybrid of Head Start, very high quality. It's a federal program with very high quality standards and funding for low income families across this country. So it's very high quality, though. It's wraparound family supports, it's certain credentials needed for the early educators and other components of that. So
that might be it, actually. So I'm trying to get the high quality piece. So what are the credentials? What are sort of the things? How would you walk into a program, I guess, and say, if I were a parent, this is the place, this is clearly high quality?
That's an even better way to approach it. So basically, you walk into a program and it's high quality because, first of all, the environment is crucial. They call it sort of the second teacher. Safe, stimulating, nurturing environment with lots of activities and age appropriate things, right, to do, materials, etc. What's really most important, though, so the environment is one aspect, and it's just very easy to identify, if you're thinking about just walking into a program and identifying this. But quality starts and finishes around the adult in the room. And I think so many understand that from the education lens as well. It's all about the interaction between the teacher and the child, and in so many aspects of our lives and sectors. So, but in this case, it's so true, and it's really well researched and documented, Senator, that some understanding of child development is needed, and the training and supports of that early educator is the core component of quality. And on the flip side, when you have a lot of turnover, which we actually see in this field because it's $13 an hour, you could get paid doing almost anything else. It's just so many of you must know early educators. They're passionate. They have had to be creative and work in adverse sort of situations for decades just to follow their passion and their training. And many of them have to have second jobs. They can't pay off their loans. So anyway, so on one hand, when you have tons of turnover, it's very poor quality, because that consistency for the child at this age is crucial. So it's a consistent, nurturing, well-prepared caregiver and educator who has some understanding of child development. Now, I will also point you to the field in Vermont is really organizing themselves through the Vermont Association of the Education of Young Children, Vermont AYC. And they are the professional organization. And as you may recall, nurses, they were sort of dismissed as, we've heard this from many, as we've talked to other industries and stuff over the years, they were dismissed as pillow fluffers, not, longer than 50 years ago. And then they've turned into a profession of nursing with everything that goes with it, the training, the credentials, the wages, et cetera. So early education across this country is going through the same evolution. In Vermont, we're actually ahead of the curve. The field is very much involved. They're organizing themselves. And there's a framework at the national level that we are really embracing in Vermont through the field that really is, I can send you the information. It's also sort of touched upon in our proposal, but it's sort of like a licensing board with 3 levels, A, B, and C. And there are all these bridges that respect and honor the experience of the field today through any transition period, if that makes sense. So it's a really well thought out process. And
parent might walk in and say, this is an A-level rated program, a B-level rated, there are standards, there are things that, the state would be going in to inspect and rate and say, hey, these guys are knocking it out of the park. These guys aren't, we're going to work with these, all that kind of thing.
So we have what's called a quality rating system already, and it's called the STAR system. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 stars. 4 and 5 are considered very high quality, and but it's also a spectrum, because when you open up your doors, you start at the beginning and then you grow. And there are incentives. You get more, for example, subsidy money for your children in your care program if you are at higher levels. So there are some financial incentives, but it's barely funded, so the market doesn't fully work at this moment. But so there is that currently. There's work that we're very involved with, Building Bright Futures, the state, very involved with, to say, what's the next generation of the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 stars? Because a lot of research has been done in the meantime. And the big component is the focus on the workforce, supporting the workforce and compensating them with those credentials. So the ABC, just to be clear about that, are really more about the mix of professionals you need in a program. Not everyone needs to have the same level of credential in a well-run, high-quality program. So some folks might say, and when I first heard it, because I've worked with the field, for many years, I said, oh no, I don't want this to be this big distraction or a big new thing. And what I heard from so many folks in the field that were doing this work, they said, actually, no. This would just streamline and clarify everything. Right now, it is so confusing to understand what credentials you need to have, how to meet the regulations. So anything that just simplifies and clarifies this, including if it moves us to high quality, is really could be a really big positive.
Great. I guess my final thing is, I'm sure you are working closely with the business community. I know businesses down my way in particular, this is a big issue for them. They want their employees to be able to have high quality access at an affordable price. I think they're also, in terms of the workforce in general, they need people to have this so that people will enter the workforce. So that's just a request.
I would say you are, if you ever want to hear directly from the horse's mouth on that, there are so many business champions right now that are just so well informed about the ins and outs of the system, the needs of the system, how it affects their bottom line and their employees, and they're willing to share how crucial the childcare challenge sort of has been as an impediment, and how deeply they are willing to be involved in the solution right now, including thinking through the financing. So absolutely. And as we're wrapping up, I just have to acknowledge Senator Lyons, because it is a little funky to be in this group in a different sort of committee talking about this with one of our mega champions. I just have to say, Senator Lyons has been instrumental in getting the policy proposal to where it is today. So it feels odd to not mention that in this different setting.
If I had a nickel for every time somebody came in here and celebrated Lions, I swear I'd be retired.
Sorry to fall into that.
Thankfully, I don't have an ego. She's just every single person. It's like, before I kick things off today, I noticed Senator Lyons is in the committee.
Thank you, Allie. I needed that. I just get such negative comments in this committee. You just heard it, right? Thank you.
Oh.
We tease the ones we love, right? Isn't that the saying? Senator Hooker.
Thank you. Allie, can you clarify for me the Head Start connection here? I know it's a federal program. How many Head Start programs are there in the state? How many kids are they serving? Are they serving, trying to serve the same kids that we're looking at? I need a little clarification on that. And secondly, you mentioned the need for 2,000 more providers. And is that based on a kind of child provider ratio based on the needs out there? How did you come up with that figure?
Oh, such good questions. So we have some follow-up to do already, and this I'll add to the list. So I don't off the top of my head have the exact numbers on Head Start. What I will tell you is the shape of it, which I think might help, and then we can follow up with that. So one is, so it's like you said, exactly, it's federal dollars, a federal program, direct to community. So that's a little interesting about that. You know, a lot of what we do is on the state level, but that's sort of, that's money and regulations, like quality standards, that goes straight from the feds to the communities. And I believe we have like 12 grantees, I believe they're called, of the Head Start, you know, dollars all around the state, and they serve regions, and they're nested in different places. For example, in Central Vermont, it's the Capstone Community Action Agency does the Head Start work. And, you know, there's Champlain Valley Head Start, Paul Berman, who's also the head of the association right now, the Head Start Association of Vermont. So they all work together well, they all gather regularly. And I would actually just probably recommend you bring a few of them in. They're wonderful. They're very smart. They have the whole like ecosystem in their minds because they see it from a very important perspective, from the Head Start perspective. And anyway, we can follow up with some of the numbers. Then I would say, think of the whole system like a layer cake, which is kind of best practice, and it's what we're going for because it's really efficient. It doesn't waste any money. And in other words, a high quality program like one in Newport that we've worked with, and Ready, Set, Grow, it's called, they take Head Start dollars first, right? So they are a Head Start, they meet the quality, you know, guidelines. So they are a Head Start partner. So they get Head Start dollars that only can use towards the low income families in their program. So there's a very like sharp cutoff for the eligible families for Head Start dollars. And then they're a pre-K provider. So they layer on the pre-K state dollars. And then they have lower income families that are eligible for childcare financial assistance, which we do have this program in Vermont, although it's not really well funded to fully, you know, be affordable for all, but that's part of what's in our proposal. So they layer that, and then they sort of see what's left over to have a high quality program, all the other services that they provide, and then they set tuition from there, if that makes sense. So there's beautiful coordination happening on the ground. This is why, though, we do need to have a conversation about the system governance, because it's complicated. And, you know, it doesn't probably make sense for every single thousands of providers from 4 kids to, you know, 150 kids or more to be dealing with all of this minutia themselves. It's a lot of, you know, it's a lot of business that they have to take care of, you know, when they're not caring and educating these children. So I think that's a really good reason why we should look at the governance and data and accountability and oversight carefully together over the course of the next year as this policy moves forward. Oh, and you had another question about how do we come up with the 2,000. I actually have a full report for you with a lot of end notes that you can dig into. But the summary is we took the supply and demand analysis of if we actually were meeting the need of about 70%, which I think was a good average for a lot of reasons, saturation rates, plus what we've identified as need. About 70% of kids in Vermont need this care based on the ratios, based on current programming. That's how many more adults, early educators you will need to meet the need. And back to Senator Campion's point about the economic ramifications of that, just for a minute, visualize an investment like this in Vermont. It all goes to Vermonters, every penny. It goes back to Vermonters so they can afford childcare. It goes to create 2,000 new jobs in the industry. It lifts the industry out of poverty wages, and it puts thousands of Vermonters back to work because they can find and afford childcare. So every dollar, because it goes to affordability and wages, which are the, you know, and compensation, which are the 2 key components that are not funded, you know, have that aspect to them.
Great. Any other questions? Ms. Richard, Senator Chinden.
I'll just say, Mrs. Richards, I'm sorry I didn't ask any thoughtful questions, but I want you to know I completely sympathize and support this agenda. I have 3 kids, and I have experienced firsthand how expensive and how much need there is for more childcare, more affordable childcare in this state. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate hearing that as I sit in my parents' bedroom, because they are my sole childcare for my 2-year-old twins through this pandemic because I lost my childcare too. Thank you very much for that.
Senator Terenzini.
I'll echo what Senator Chittenden just said, except I have 4 kids and he has 3. So
Woo!
It's a
I
very
appreciate
competitive
that.
group.
Competitive, and I understand that you truly understand what we're
Yes.
talking about here. Thank you for sharing that.
Ms. Richards, thank you very much. Appreciate you coming in and spending as much time as you did with us. Glad to know things are in the House, and looks like this is something that certainly Senator Lyons will be involved in with regard to her committee, and it likely will make its way over here at some point as well when it, after crossover. So it's good to have this heads up. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I look forward to being with you all again. Bye.
Thank you. Committee, let's just take a 5-minute stretch and we'll come back and jump into literacy. Reminder to mute and get rid of your video. Thank you. Ms. Myers, I don't think we've had the pleasure, but I've heard great things about you and your work.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
It's great to have you here. Ms. Bonesteel, am I pronouncing that correctly? Terrific. Great to meet you, and I think Mr. Tinney is also on the line. Okay, committee. We are, if you're following along at home, we are picking up the literacy bill, of which we have a draft of, a draft committee bill based on some conversations with the Agency of Education and our general interest in working to improve literacy here in the state of Vermont. So with that, we have our first witnesses in to talk with us about the draft bill. It does a few things, and so we are going to hear from first Chelsea Myers, who is with the Associate Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association. Then we'll hear from Libby Bonesteel, who is a Superintendent of Schools in the Montpelier Roxbury Public School District, and then Donald Tinney, who is the President of the Vermont NEA. So Ms. Myers, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for having us here to present on this really important topic. Just quickly, Chelsea Myers, Associate Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association. This particular subject I am very passionate about. I began my career in the neuroscience of reading, researching the neuroscience of reading, went on to become a school teacher, and then studied education policy in grad school, and now found myself back home in Vermont with the Vermont Superintendents Association. So I'm really happy to be here. Libby and I are actually going to deliver testimony together. I'm going to kind of provide the broad overview, and then I invited Libby here, who is also very passionate about literacy, to kind of give a perspective of what it might look like on the ground from just one superintendent. So I'm going to ask Libby if she would introduce herself now.
Yes, hi everybody. Thank you for having us today. I'm Libby Bonesteel. I am the superintendent from Montpelier Roxbury, and please call me Libby. That's absolutely fine. And yes, I have a pretty big background in literacy as well. I testified to the House committee a few times last year on literacy. I used to be, in my old world before I turned to the dark side of administration, a literacy coach and teacher developer, primarily in the world of literacy. I've spent a lot of time in Brooklyn and international doing a lot of teacher development work in reading and writing instruction. So I have a pretty strong background in that, and I have a whole lot of soapboxes to stand on when it comes to literacy, which Chelsea has had the privilege of hearing many times. So thank you for having us.
Great, thank you. It sounds like we have two great people in to talk to us about this, so appreciate it.
So the testimony will aim to both speak directly to the proposed legislation and to provide further considerations on the subject of literacy policy and reform in general. First, it is important to state that VSA and its members view the improvement of literacy instruction and subsequently literacy outcomes as critically important. In fact, in a recent survey of our members, that was a top priority for them from the policy arena. We asked that any policy directive on literacy consider the following. Equity must be at the forefront of this work. Data indicate that students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, BIPOC students, English language learners, and students with disabilities are disproportionately not getting what they need from the system to succeed in learning to read and write at the benchmark set for all students. Equitable access to highly skilled instruction must be a top priority in supporting this work. This can likely not be achieved without additional targeted resources. Recruitment and retention of teachers and administrators that are highly skilled in reading instruction is a challenge and also a non-negotiable. In being able to successfully implement any literacy reform, the ability to recruit highly skilled teachers is disparate around the state, and it has only gotten worse through the pandemic. Accountability through data is not successful without a clear vision of outcomes, targeted supports, and a growth mindset. Set targeted outcomes, but allow LEAs to determine the best methods to achieve those outcomes based on the work already taking place in their communities. What I've learned is now affectionately deemed the Vermont way. All literacy reform decisions should be informed by skilled literacy experts. To the extent possible, legislation should consider the myriad of initiatives on school districts' plates and create expectations and timelines accordingly. So in response to the proposed draft bill, just a couple of points that we walked through when going through the bill. In the findings, we appreciate the reference to Act 173 and ask that due consideration be given to the structures already outlined in that piece of legislation and other state law and policy related to this issue, such as the VTMTSS, education quality standards, and more. The law also makes reference to support provided to the field from the Agency of Education to implement the findings from the DMG report that led to the Act 173 bill. We recommend that reference to disaggregated data that points to the inequities in access to literacy be highlighted in the findings, as this is an important component of literacy reform. So to get into the specific details, in Part 18, the school board policy, the vehicle proposed to facilitate the recommendations in A through C is a board policy. We recommend speaking with the Vermont School Boards Association on the use of board policy to achieve the stated goals. It might be that adopting a school board policy for some of these recommendations is an unnecessary step. In terms of a benchmark literacy assessment, we believe this is a very useful idea. Schools are already using benchmark literacy assessments to monitor student progress in academic skill areas, including reading. Statewide data from pre-K to grade 3 should be used to monitor progress in literacy achievement and subsequently to inform professional learning and future policy initiatives. The Agency of Education should outline what it expects to do with the data when collected. Any benchmark literacy assessment should be specifically tied to professional development for instructors on how to use the data collected to inform instruction and support students. Finally, members of our association wonder about the legitimacy of Lexiles as the only reportable indicator to the state. I'm gonna, Libby knows a lot more about the Lexile question and kind of her beliefs on that, so I'm gonna ask her to speak on that.
Yeah, when the Common Core came out, they named Lexiles as a measure to look at text complexity.
Yeah, great, thanks. Before you start, I just want to just go back for 1 minute. Chelsea, you're going to submit all this in writing? Have you already?
I did. It came a little bit late, so it might not be posted yet.
And I appreciate the direction on Lexiles. This is something that the committee isn't familiar with at all in terms of testing and evaluations. So I appreciate you taking the time to walk us through that.
Yeah, fire away any questions because I can get pretty wonky on this one. So with Lexile levels,
Libby, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Can you start by defining Lexiles?
Yeah, I'll get there. I got it. So they came into real prominence when the Common Core came out because they're mentioned in the Common Core as a measure. The Common Core didn't necessarily state that if we abided by the Common Core state standards, had to use Lexile as a measure of reader development. However, it did use that as a measure for us to look at text complexity. It's one way a Lexile is one way to measure a text. So when a text is in front of any reader, doesn't matter if it's a child or an adult, there's 3 ways that make that text complex. So one way is by the number of sentences, the types of word length, that like quantitative. You could put a sentence into a computer and it can spit out a number at you telling you what complexity that sentence is based on the words and the sentence length, the punctuation that's used, that kind of thing. The other 2 are looking at the content or the theme and the maturity level that comes out of the book. So that requires a whole lot of reader development and thinking. That's basically where the comprehension works comes in reading. And then the third is considering the reader and the text consideration. So it's the reason why I don't know. I have a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old, and my 12-year-old certainly could read dinosaur books at the age of 4 or 5 that were a whole lot more complex. If you put those long words in front of a 4-year-old in a completely different context, they wouldn't have been able to do it. But he was really into dinosaurs, so he could read Tyrannosaurus Rex, right? So you have to consider the reader and the text complexity. It's those 3 things that make up a text and the understanding of a text. Lexiles only measure one of those things. They measure the word count and sentence count and punctuation. So a Lexile level completely ignores the comprehension and actual thinking work that a reader has to do with a text. This comes into problematic because a lot of the bill that I've read is really focusing on K-3 learning, which I don't disagree with. I think we have to, if a kid is behind after grade 3, all of us can agree that they're going to struggle for a really long time as a reader. It's much harder to catch them up after grade 3. So I'm totally behind looking at primary literacy. However, there's no Lexile for primary literacy. The books are too simple, right? The complexity is not, it's not complex enough. Lexiles actually start in the Common Core, really having meaning in the grades 2nd grade to 3rd grade band. So it's not a useful measure for our primary readers. There are other useful measures that we could look at, but it's not a useful measure. So that's one reason why I would really question the use of Lexiles as a measure in which districts are to report out scores. Another is that one of our goals, of course, any one of us would agree, is to create lifelong critical thinkers and readers, right? We want our kids to choose books as something to do in life, right? It's something to do. Rather than play video games or watch TV, we want them to pick up those books and really enjoy it and be a lifelong reader. In order to do that, it has nothing to do with sentence count or word count or the type of punctuation. It has to do with the reader. It has to do with their interest in the book, and it has to do with the meaning the reader makes from those books. The two areas that Lexiles do not measure. And so when you're putting Lexile pieces into a law, what we tend to do as educators is define our practice with those words, right? And we don't want to have teachers defining what reading is simply by counting the words in the sentences. That's a very concerning idea for me. And then very quickly, the other thing that I want to point out is that because it only counts words, it's not an accurate source for books. So I would encourage the committee, just Google Lexile appropriateness or something like that. The book Night by Elie Wiesel, that is talking about the horrors of the Holocaust. Is everybody familiar with that book?
Yes.
It's very poignant. It's talking about his experiences in the Holocaust in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Sorry, the two.
Bergen-Belsen.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Lyons. That when you put that through a Lexile reader, it's at the 2nd grade band. Like that's a 2nd grade book according to Lexiles, right? The book Maze Runner, which is a YA novel, it's a young adult novel. It's about a group of boys who are kidnapped and put into a maze, and one girl joins them. So there's a lot of sexual overtones, and then zombies attack them. And it has a lot of death and a lot of violence in it. That's a 2nd to 3rd grade band in the Lexile because the sentence structure is so simple in the book. When I was a 2nd grade teacher, and so something like the A to Z mysteries, which is like, going to find out if that little character has the stolen ball, right? That's an appropriate book for a 2nd and 3rd grade reader. Lexiles aren't appropriate measure for what we want our educators to be putting in front of kids necessarily. So there's a lot of challenges to Lexile. It's one of I actually like the Common Core as a standards document. I wish they never used that word, however. So I would encourage any effort to quantify reading, and I'm not sure if that belongs in a law or not, but any measure that quantifies reading really goes back to what we believe in Vermont, which is proficiency-based understanding. So what's the proficiency we want kids at the end of kindergarten to have? Our Common Core does that. It points it out pretty specifically, and we could easily create a local assessment plan statewide. I'm not against that, statewide, that can look at proficiencies in grades K through 3 that involve the decoding, phonics, that kind of thing that Lexiles look at or might measure, and also takes into consideration making meaning, understanding, critical thinking skills, all of those beginning pieces. So Chelsea, you want to keep going? That's my soapbox on Lexiles, but I'm happy to also take any questions you have.
Yeah, well, let's just pause there for a moment and just talk about evaluations and what you would recommend us to use as it relates to, this third grade level. You agree, I think, we have a problem in this state. I mean, our neighbors in the South, in Massachusetts and other states, Mississippi, we know, is knocking it out of the park with literacy rates, and getting kids to read, not only for pleasure, but of course, these are skills that, are keeping some kids, or lack of skills, out of the job market. So how would you recommend we evaluate third graders, or not?
Third graders. I think they're
Or
accountability for me.
I mean, maybe it's younger. Maybe it sounds to me like, we did hear from one a colleague, perhaps of yours, another literacy expert, that said, first grade is really key.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe it's not third grade.
First grade is actually, if I'm slightly biased because, again, I was a first grade, second grade teacher, but first grade is by far the hardest grade to teach in a K-12 system. We need the best teachers in first grade. And I can give you the reason why in terms of reading. In terms of reading, a first grader comes in, a 6-year-old comes into the classroom reading very patterned text. Words are the same except for that last word on the page. They use the pictures quite heavily in order to read it. They end with doing episodic chapter books like Henry and Mudge. So it's a literal chapter book, very simple chapter book for beginning chapter book, but that's where they end first grade. There's a huge amount of growth. Right. So right there alone, I mean, knowing that, putting a lot of emphasis on kindergarten and first grade reading would get us very far, very far. And because then second and third grade is building that body. Second and third grade is much more about quantity and reading a lot and growing this idea of, I know how books tend to go. First and second grade, kindergarten and first grade is very much getting the skills you need. Those skills can be pretty easily measured through a proficiency-based assessment, like letter ID and recognition, like letter sound correspondence, like phonemic awareness and rhyming, and a simple retell, what happened in that book, which is the basics for comprehension that any kid needs. These are all things that can be measured relatively quickly. And I can give you some, Chelsea and I talked about this a little bit. As a teacher in New York City, we had an assessment that it was a book that everybody in this New York City public schools, which is bigger than Vermont, every kid had a book, and it had those basic reading skills in it, the sight words decoding, rhyming, that kind of thing, with proficiency scales benchmarked in there. And so you assess the kids 3 times a year. And when a kid hit the benchmark, you didn't have to assess them anymore because they were proficient, right? Because they've reached proficiency. So I would encourage us, when we're looking at accountability, which I'm a big believer in accountability, and I don't think it's a bad word, that when we're looking at accountability, though, it's also based in our value system, which is around proficiency-based grading. The Common Core clearly lays out very well what those foundational skills are in literacy. And we can use that as a gateway to developing a top-notch accountability system. And then it goes to what Chelsea was just referring to earlier in terms of using that data to create professional development opportunities for our teachers, particularly at the primary level, because I believe we do need a lot of professional development there. And we do also need a lot of professional development in our intervention techniques, which the DMG report clearly spelled out. So
all that is incredibly helpful, particularly the idea that K and 1 is a foundation and the 2 to 3 is sort of, I can't remember, your words were better, but just reading a lot, like just.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. If you're a policymaker and you want to make certain that you can say, listen, our state is making improvements in this regard, rightfully so, people have got to be accountable. How do we evaluate? What is the test that legislators and policymakers, what's the data that we should be collecting?
So before Libby responds with her thoughts on that, I just want to recognize that benchmark literacy assessments are used throughout the state. I'm sure some are better than others. And I don't want to make any assumptions about the Agency of Education's proposal for Lexiles, but it might be because that is a generalizable number or score that can come from the myriad of different benchmark assessments that are already being used across the state. I don't think, Libby can perhaps correct me, that that's the only generalizable one that will show up in most of the benchmark assessments, but I could be wrong. So just wanted to throw that out there, that Libby might use a different tool than some other systems, but both might be equally as beneficial or useful for those students because they all get at some similar concepts. So
Chelsea, what are we using right now that gives us the number, the 50% number, what is it that
SBAC scores in third grade.
okay. Say that again.
SBAC scores in third grade. The state does not collect any information on our kindergarten, first and second graders.
Okay. And is that process at third grade, those scores, is that an accurate measurement?
It's a standardized test.
Yeah.
So you can dig into it a bit.
Okay.
It's more programmatic, I believe, than it is. A teacher couldn't look at it and say, I need to take Chelsea and I need to work on this with her tomorrow.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm thinking again, and I completely respect and understand what you're saying around, there's certain things that teachers are going to need in their classrooms to focus and, in particular areas with students. I'm just thinking again, and I almost hate to do it just because I get like some of these evaluatory, if you will, processes aren't always accurate, but I'm thinking from policymaker standpoints and from parents and others, what are the kinds of things they should? I think Massachusetts uses, is it the NEAP? I'll take a look, but please,
NAEP.
NAEP. Then if they're using NAEP, then that's a fourth grade score.
Okay, they are using NAEP. NAEP.
That's a fourth grade score.
Okay.
And that's an international benchmark standardized test. So the things that I think about is that we do have local assessment systems because it's a requirement for us. However, each one of us defines that differently. So if we're thinking about policy and really saying that foundational skills, which is the language of the Common Core, foundational skills and literacy are essential to creating lifelong readers, which they are, there's no denying that, then the state might want to think about a statewide foundational skill assessment that we have to report out. There's not that many of them, first of all. We can make pretty broad things. So to do that type of assessment is not, primary teachers mostly are doing them anyway, I would imagine, but I don't know because everybody's is different. So I used to be a curriculum director up in the Swanton area for Missisquoi Valley. Our local assessment plan was very different than what my local assessment plan here is in Montpelier Roxbury. Does it probably get at the same things? Maybe. We don't necessarily report it the same way here. So there's just differences. So yes, we have one, but we don't report it to the Agency of Education. So there's little accountability at that level, at the K3 level or K2 level. And they're all different.
Another concept could be to allow a couple of choices. So then you are not thrusting a ton of change if it's measuring similar components of reading. So the Agency of Education could select, 5 that have the same outputs as one another, and the local systems could choose from those.
There's only so many ways you can do letter ID. There's only so many letters in the alphabet.
Yeah. Okay.
Are you saying we need more letters in the alphabet?
No, I'm not saying that at all. It's hard enough for a 5-year-old.
Should we keep going?
Please.
Great. So in part B, that it identifies a process for identifying struggling readers, including those with dyslexia, and also includes an intervention process for those students. So identifying struggling readers, including those at risk for dyslexia, that's a key distinction between those with dyslexia and those at risk for dyslexia, is a key prevention and early intervention strategy. However, those individuals with a dyslexia diagnosis are supported by IEPs under the IDEA, which includes dyslexia as part of the specific learning disability definition. It is not appropriate to use early screening methods to diagnose dyslexia, but instead to identify all struggling readers, including those that are at a potential risk for developing dyslexia. Our goal in any early screening program should be to identify all struggling readers. Any process for identifying struggling readers is only as good as the sport to the field on how to read and appropriately respond to data. Libby was kind of talking a little bit about this. If you hand a teacher a tool and they don't know how to the next day impact their teaching for a particular student with that tool, then the tool's no good. A board policy alone, in our opinion, will do very little to significantly change how the field is able to respond to evidence that a student is struggling in reading. So I'm going to pause and let Libby respond to that section as well.
Senator Terenzini, please jump in.
Chelsea, you wouldn't be in favor of doing early childhood screening for dyslexia, kindergarten, first grade?
So early screeners are not actually diagnosing dyslexia. That is a very, very long process that requires considerable skill and expertise. I would imagine that in local assessment plans, and Libby can correct me if I'm wrong, there are already tools being used to screen students that might have difficulties meeting literacy benchmarks, which would include risk factors for later developing dyslexia. It does no good to put a label of dyslexia on a student from only using one of these small, short screener tools. That involves a much longer process. And I'll let Libby also contribute because she looks eager to.
No, you did a really good job there, Chelsea. You did a really nice job. Dyslexia is a special education identification. IDEA does take care of dyslexia. It would be doubling up on that. And I agree with Chelsea. The other thing to think about is that we want to give kids time to develop. Not all kids develop at the same rate in the same time. Yes, we have age appropriate benchmarks that we do use. However, not all kids develop at that rate. A lot of it depends on what background they came from. It's connected to your Let's Grow Kids conversation earlier, and what kind of early education, what kind of language development did they have with parents at that age. And sometimes when a kid gets to school, they've heard only statements. They haven't heard sentences. No fault of the kids and no fault of that brain of theirs, except in school. But school is the first time that they hear an adult really speaking in sentences, long sentences to them and talking to them in conversation. Those kids catch up pretty quickly. But if we were to label them as dyslexic as a kindergartner, that label is going to follow them for the rest of their years. And there is zero evidence that label will actually help them as a reader. In fact, there's more evidence that says if we label kids the earlier, especially with reading difficulties, they will be pulled from grade level reading instruction typically. They will be given less rigorous instruction, not based on the skills they need. And they will continue to fall further and further behind their peers. So there's a lot to be said there. I would be the very first person to tell you that the MTSS or RTI, whatever you want to call it, systems that we've developed in education, not just in Vermont, but in education, is not working for kids. What we've essentially done is created a secondary special education system where there's not as much paperwork involved. And that is not okay. That is an area that we in Vermont, that the DMG was completely and utterly clear on, that we need significant work in as a system. That includes the most expert person in the room, being the one who's teaching our tangled readers and writers and mathematicians. So there are other things that I don't believe that screening for dyslexia is going to have any kind of vast improvement. In fact, I think that it actually might do the opposite for our readers because it would take them out of less rigorous instruction. And that's not okay. So I would be very concerned to have mandatory screening for dyslexia as a superintendent. And I'd have to really do a whole lot of work within my district to have teachers understand exactly what it was that we were going to do with that indicator, which would not be to label a child.
That being said, tools that measure whether all kids are meeting certain benchmarks in literacy are valuable, but it
Right.
doesn't need to be tied to a specific diagnosis that early on. And those tools can be used really well to inform practice for teachers that are highly skilled in reading to make sure that kids very early on are getting the support that they need. So it is a valuable tool when considered in the perspective of identifying components of reading for an individual student that they might be struggling with at that moment in time.
Well, your feedback's important because we were approached, and I'm the lead sponsor on a bill to introduce here soon to actually screen in Vermont for dyslexia. And so I don't want to speak for Senator Campion, but if this bill goes anywhere, I'm sure your testimony will be important to our committee at that time.
And I will be right there. I will definitely be right there.
We've already heard from, I think, the Dyslexia Society, if you will, the association. Yep. We've also heard from some parents, I know in my district, who have children that really believe that this testing is important. And so it's just know that we're going to continue this conversation and that we'll likely have a bill that will spark, I'm sure, a robust dialogue.
Yeah, I would look forward to talking to you further about that, because it is something that I worry about. Yeah. I have strong concerns over.
Okay, back to general literacy.
Great. So the next section in the bill talks about annual monitoring report on student literacy scores from local school boards. It makes sense that data reported to the Agency of Education should also be made publicly available at the local level where data privacy laws allow. Again, increasing the amount of data in the hands of the board is only one piece of the puzzle. School boards must be educated in how to use the data to inform policy decisions at the local level. The next section talks about annual evaluation of superintendent job performance, including improving student literacy outcomes. Superintendent evaluation is a process determined and supported by local school boards and should remain as such. We highly recommend that you retract this element of the proposed bill. The superintendent is one piece of a very large and complex set of influences on literacy outcomes. Tying job performance evaluation to specific academic outcomes is devoid of any data to support its efficacy. It also lacks the recognition and appreciation for the immense number of responsibilities a superintendent and any other education leader has on their plate. It's just one small piece of the puzzle.
And absolutely, I mean, it's good to hear this, and I think we'll continue to take testimony. It is, when we're faced with, again, the numbers that we're facing in this state, and I sometimes compare education to educators like physicians and hospital structures in a way. And if a patient were getting misdiagnosed over and over and over and over again, if there were big problems in a hospital, the CEO would have a problem. I mean, it would. And the CEO also has a lot of issues on his or her hands as it relates to running a hospital, managing a hospital, doctors, nurses, patients. So I'm not sure I agree yet with pulling that, I for one. I mean, we've got to put this front and center. And again, I respect all the work the superintendents are doing, but we have, and again, I'm not putting blame there, but we have a huge problem on our hands. I want families to come to Vermont because this is the place where they will learn how to read and be successful. And these numbers, are challenging at best. So I think I appreciate you putting that on the table, but this, for me, it's, and I think I don't want to speak for the committee, but I think for most people, this is a big issue.
Something else to recognize as well is literacy reform takes years to see actual measurable results on the large scale, and superintendent tenure is not always long enough to see those results. There are a lot of elements of this that we kind of find challenging, and I'll let Libby speak because she, that's her job that we're speaking about. So
it is. I've said it a few times already. I am not opposed to accountability in any way, shape, or form. And it is my job to ensure that our students are learning at high levels every single day. And if you ask any one of our teachers, they will say that to you, that that's my mantra. And it's a motto. And we ensure every interviewee that we have is asked that question. It's something that I hold dear and true to my heart. I do agree that there are many influences on literacy achievement levels. And it's not an excuse. It's something that we haven't figured out as an education world, how to systematize and how to make work. So my literacy scores, you would not be talking to me about my evaluation because of my literacy scores in SPECT. Compared to the rest of the state, they're very good. I will tell you honestly, we are nowhere where we need to be in terms of our literacy instruction and what we're doing for our kids in Montpelier Roxbury. Now, I look at some of my colleagues who have much different scores on their third grade SBAC or fourth grade SBAC because they have a much different student population. Right now, while I have some of the best teachers in the state, because I'm a little biased on that, I can also say that our kids are readers primarily because they're coming from very literate backgrounds already. Mm-hmm. And so that has nothing to do with me as in my job performance as superintendent. It's because I was hired in Montpelier Roxbury and I wasn't hired in Winooski, which is they're coming from much different language backgrounds, much different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so what basically, and there's a whole lot of work to do that encompasses a lot there. And I'm not kid blaming. I'm the last person to kid blame, and I certainly am not family blaming. However, literacy is too complex. And so my question would be, if you're looking to supersede board role and evaluation, then how will the legislation take into account the complexity that has to do with literacy development? And how will you take into account the socioeconomic factors that many communities in Vermont are different? And also, how do you take into account teacher retention and recruitment? Like I said, I used to work in Swanton and Missisquoi Valley, where if we had an opening for a teacher position, we would get maybe 5 applicants, most of them right out of college. And when I worked in Essex as a principal, I had a kindergarten opening and I had 65 applicants, most of which had 5 years of teaching under their belt already. That is a completely different thing that a superintendent can't control. You know, in Swanton, even the best of circumstances, I was recruiting from not 180, right? Because I was at the Canadian border. I wasn't 180. It was even like that corner, right? That corner niche, because it was right on the lake. But here in Montpelier, I have a complete circle around me of anywhere in an hour around me for a commute. I have a huge recruitment base and people want to come to Montpelier work. So there are so many facets that come into this. And teacher and principal, retention, recruitment, capacity, and pedagogical effectiveness and instructional effectiveness are the 2 highest factors in student achievement. And if you can't keep teachers and you can't keep leaders because they move from Franklin County to Chittenden County constantly, that's a significant, then you're going to keep turning over superintendents because they're going to be evaluated out because they're not going to have the performance. And that's not going to do anything for system change either. So I think it's broader. It's a bigger picture.
Your point about teachers is a great one. You know, in the research, and I think former President Obama used to say it all the time, you know, you get a good teacher and you get a really great teacher in the classroom. And those issues of poverty and what's brought, sometimes the negative things that are brought to a classroom are really diminished. I mean, they really, in a lot of ways, start to disappear. And I know we've heard a little bit of research about that kind of thing too, that, you know, that great teacher, like you're saying, somebody who has 5 years experience, somebody who's been in the classroom, it can really, really make a difference. So I think that's a great point. Senator Lyons.
There it goes. So there's so much in what you're saying, and it's very helpful and encompassing for the specific school and families and cultures that exist in the school. But if we were to take a little snapshot today of maybe where we are or where an individual district is with respect to literacy, and then establish some benchmarks, not to get worse, maybe to get better, or at least hold their own. What would that look like? What would it look like now? And wouldn't that be a place to begin, regardless of longevity of teachers or of superintendents?
Yeah, Chelsea and I had this might be a bird walk, and I may not be answering your question. So if I'm not, then please interrupt me. Chelsea and I were going off on this yesterday because, once I get started, obviously I keep going. And so Chelsea asked me, like, what would you want? Like, if you really had something, what would you want? And I do think back to my time in Brooklyn, where we had networks of schools and went into each other's buildings and coached each other, worked through problems of practice. It was all based in literacy, every single one of them. And there was a person facilitating it who was an expert in literacy development. And so we were able to talk across buildings, across districts. It was lovely. It was wonderful. And so one of the things I was thinking about in terms of yes, there's the accountability, but it's hard to have accountability without the vision, right? Without the vision of success. And I just wonder if there's a way in Vermont to develop model schools where schools who are struggling a little bit more can go visit, talk about the systems, talk about the structures that are in place, talk about what really made the difference. How did you get that increase? We don't have the vision. It's all local control. And so one of the things I think that's missing in Vermont with literacy instruction is that it's a hodgepodge of strategies. It's a hodgepodge of just what people already know. There's no university who's saying, here's literacy lab schools. Here's where we can all go and learn together and have a common understanding of what best practice is. And in bigger states, you have that, right? In bigger cities, you have that. So I just wonder if we could somehow, if we're thinking out of the box, thinking about what that vision is, hold schools accountable based on proficiency marks and proficiencies that we name, right? And then get them support through our colleagues in other buildings rather than shaming and blaming a little bit.
So, I agree with you on that 100%. And I know that, I see Don Tinney is here. I know that the NEA in the past has had some statewide conferences that included teachers' development on best practices in various areas. And wouldn't that be a neat place to start? So doesn't have to be school by school, but certainly a cohort of educators or administrators.
And what we know about growth, right? And what actually influences teacher change and pedagogical practice change is that conferences and one-shot deals may influence thinking about 5% of the time, right? And so but instructional coaching, a strong instructional coach influences practice about 85% of the time. You combine instructional coaching with networking and systems development with experts, that increases it to 95%. So we want to think about what do we know about change efforts and what do we know about how people actually change and sustain the change over time. Because we all know the research around you get a new math textbook and the next year you have higher math scores and then 2 years later you don't, right? So how do we sustain the change? And that's through a high quality instructional coaching program, which not every school in the state has. And it's through networking with experts, and it's talking and collaborating about that practice. And so we could develop that kind of thing in Vermont. We're small enough. We could develop it. So if we're thinking about money, I know part of this bill was about money. How do we encourage school districts at a time when budgets are tight and are not going to get any looser in the next few years to really think about literacy coaching? And then how do we coach those coaches up to become experts? So they're not just the first grade teacher who's really good with kids, right? How do we really coach them up so that they're experts in their field? And could we do that statewide so that we have a common understanding of what it means? I think those are some of the questions that need to be asked when we're really thinking about growth, change, and sustaining that change and that growth over time.
I'll just say leaders are really hungry for this. We're now in the second year of running an instructional leadership academy for school leaders. And this year we have doubled the capacity of enrollment, and we luckily were able to open another cohort for our school leaders. But people want this really badly and are scrounging to find any resources to pay for it. So,
Senator Perchlik.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Libby and Chelsea. This is great testimony. And one of the issues that we have as citizen legislators is that we're not education policy experts. So I haven't looked at the written testimony. So I don't know if you have specific suggestions for the bill, but that would be helpful, because I don't have a problem with anything that you've said in any of your testimony, but it's difficult for me to think about how we would change the bill exactly to meet those goals. So any suggestions you have on the specifics would definitely be helpful for me. And specifically on the performance-based assessments, because I'm not even convinced that the third grade SBAC scores is what we should be using now. Do we really? I mean, it's definitely, I agree we have a problem because they're so low, but it could be that it's not even really an accurate picture. So, and since we've gone to performance, proficiency-based assessment, how would we put that into a bill so we can have accountability that we've all agreed that we want? So getting your help on how we actually kind of craft the bill to reach those goals would be great.
Anytime you want me to sit with you, Senator Perchlik, and write this bill, you let me know. I'm right there with you.
All right.
I just want to echo what Senator Perchlik said, everything. And I think Chelsea did submit some testimony, but we do want to take some steps here, and we do need to take some steps in this state. So any recommendations, if you wouldn't mind, please forwarding them along. This is, as I'll continue to say, it's a big issue. And I think a lot of the stuff you've put forward is great, and it echoes what we heard, I think it was last week or the week before, some kind of centralized spot, some, literacy experts in, districts, in schools, people that, you can go to, people that can train teachers, work with teachers. All those kinds of things are really important. And I think I, for one, would certainly go to bat, and I suspect my colleagues would as well, for the dollars that we need, because we can't keep going like this. I mean, people continue to ask us in this state, why do our students have an incredibly high graduation rate, and our post-graduation rate in terms of higher education is not even close to being decent. So I think a lot of this stuff is tied in. What are students, you talk to President Joyce Judy, they're doing a lot of remediation around these kinds of issues at the college level. Our state colleges are telling us this too. And all of this goes back to, I think, a lot of the conversations we've had today, 0 to 5, and what these early years in schools look like. And I think perhaps for decades and decades, we always focus so much on higher education. That's where we need to get those professors, we need to get all these kinds of things happening at higher ed, but really our emphasis, I think we're learning more and more, is that 0 to 5, those early education years are so essential for success going forward.
Yeah, and Senator Campion, another thing to think about on the flip side, on the older end of the spectrum, Penny Kittle wrote a great book called Book Love, and it talks about high school readers. And she did some research. She called around to thousands of or hundreds of campuses and things like that, and interviewed a lot of former students. She's a high school English teacher in New Hampshire. And what she found out that an average freshman in college is asked to read 6 to 8 complex nonfiction texts per week, their freshman year. Okay. So it does speak to this idea of quantity and what we're asking kids to read at the middle and high school levels as well. If they're all reading the same tired old Island of the Blue Dolphins, right. And their teacher is marching through that text with them, they're not reading enough.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if they're not reading multiple books a week that are complex, and our teachers aren't teaching them how to access these complex books at the middle and high school level, then we're not doing our job.
Yeah, I agree. And I would just push back a little bit. You know, there might be a reason for that. And it might be the way that students for decades have arrived in middle school, you know, that they might not be able to do this work because we have got to focus on that 0 to 5 in those early education years.
So if I could just respond to Senator Perchlik real quick, I do have several policy considerations at the end of my testimony. I don't know if you want me to go through them now. And then I could make more specific targeted recommendations following up to that question. Do you want me to finish the testimony, or are we short on time?
We're getting a little short on time. I'm going to go to Senator Hooker now, and we can always have you all back since this is a priority. Senator Hooker.
Just a really quick question. Libby, you mentioned creating model schools, and I'm just curious. I mean, we have some wonderful schools in this state, and do we have an inventory of those schools that might serve as those model schools, or at least the beginning of those model schools? It's just kind of I guess, a rhetorical question. Maybe the agency needs to answer it more than you do.
Yeah, and I think if by answering that question, we'd have to know what are the measures. What's the evidence that it is a model school? Would be one of my questions that I would want to be asked. And if it's focused in literacy specifically, what is the evidence that this is a model literacy school? Which further narrows that question. So I can speak Union Elementary School. I would send my kids there in a heartbeat. It's one of my elementary schools in my district, has some of the best teachers I've ever met, the most dedicated professionals. They also have a lot of room to grow in terms of their literacy instruction. So we're not at the model school, but let me tell you, if you developed a system where there was actually a model school to be had, we'd get there. We'd very much get there. But that needs to be clearly defined as to what that means. It's not just a score on an SBAC. Because that has more to do with the type of kid that you are working with than potentially, not all the time, but potentially it could have that influence. So there has to be some structures and systems and evidence in place in order to define what that means.
Great. Chelsea, we are, only because we do have another witness, we do want to continue this conversation with you. Would you mind forwarding your testimony? And that will give us something from which to work.
Yeah, no problem. I gave it to Jeannie this morning. And at the bottom, I just highly recommend, I pulled a lot of information from policy briefs from a number of really reputable organizations that make recommendations around literacy. I pulled some that I think are really particularly useful for the Vermont context and touch on some of the things that Libby talked about as well. So if you can.
Yeah, and if we would love for the two of you to continue to partner with us as we make our way through this. I mean, this is important stuff. You two know an awful lot more than anybody on this committee. We just recognize, as you do, the issue. And so any kind of suggestions for a bill that you believe would make a difference, down the road. In understanding also, so much of this cannot be evaluated in a year. It can be, it takes time, but we would love to put ourselves on the path to continue to build on success that some schools are having. So we would welcome the two of you. We know you're both incredibly busy, particularly Libby, since this is not your job to be in this committee. As Chelsea, we could say it's a little bit of her job, but we appreciate your expertise, your passion, your commitment to this, and your ideas. I think you hit on a number of incredibly important points. And even going back to what Libby said about teachers, how can we recruit? How can we get 25 teachers applying to some of these schools? It's a huge issue. And then keeping them so that they can continue to build on the years of experience they have, the years of work they have with their principals and superintendents and literacy experts, et cetera. So I'm looking to both of you to say you'll commit to working with us.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you centered on one thing to start with, it would be a lot of states have set just a vision. Like, what do you hope for in the future? Like a bottom line around literacy. It doesn't need to be put in policy, but a goal for the state could be a really good unifying kind of picture more broadly for the field.
And I also just want to recognize, on a point of personal privilege, I guess, I completely agree that these test scores are not the end all, in any way, shape, or form. It's just as policymakers and families looking in and others, that's what we have right now. I mean, it's just something that we have to look at. And, but I agree, nobody, I think it's tough on kids to get these scores, and teachers and and see a score that might not be, that really represents where a child is. So Senator Perschlick, please say something much more articulate than I'm saying.
I was just gonna tell Libby that I'll respond to one of the many emails I get from her from just being a parent in Montpelier.
Oh, no, I hope you're not going to publicly shame me.
No. I wanna talk to you more about this, but like Senator Campion said, and you're busy running a school district and not working on this. But anytime you and Chelsea have, I would welcome the opportunity to work with you to make the bills as good as we can make it.
Well, it's definitely something both Chelsea and I know care a huge deal about. So I think it is my job to work very closely with all of you. And just Senator Campion, quickly, the SBAC scores, I'm a literacy expert. I know what those SBAC scores says. My 12-year-old reads voraciously. And right now, what else does he have to do? Right. So, and his SBAC score comes back as a 2 every single year. And I every single year say, who cares? So.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I would love to get somewhere where we can really have, some accuracy around these kinds of things, but really only parents and children and teachers.
Yep.
You guys have been great. You've stuck with us and allowed us to have a really important dialogue. So I'd say you're our 2 favorite witnesses so far, but that would insult everybody who's been here for the past month. But you guys are definitely in the top 10%.
I'll take it. Thank you. We look forward to being back with you.
I really can't thank you enough. And, if we were all on committee together, we'd have like a parting gift of some kind. So we'll wait until we're all here together. Thank you both.
Thank you. Feel free to contact me whenever.
Thank you. Okay, let's just take another 5-minute quick stretch. We will then return and continue this conversation a little bit with the NEA. Thank you. How are you, Mr. Tinney?
Thank you. How are you?
Fine. We'll start in just a minute.
Sure. I'm just happy to be here with Senator Lyons and thanking her for all of her support of educators over the years.
I don't know, you guys.
I swear, I don't think it's, I like the idea of Governor Lyons.
Governor, yes, absolutely.
There we go.
Actually, it would be inappropriate, but I wouldn't mind publicly saying what Libby and Chelsea said is good.
Oh, good. Okay.
And then you don't have to listen to me. They made excellent points that I support.
I was looking at your testimony. It looks good. And you
Thank
did agree with a lot of the points that they made.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. They both do great work.
Well, thank you for being with us, and appreciate you
Sure.
also listening in prior to testifying yourself, so you have a good understanding of where
Absolutely.
we're at, some of the things that we are working towards. So with that, Mr. Tinney.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Senators. For the record, I'm Don Tinney, President of Vermont NEA, representing over 12,000 educators from every corner of the state. And while I sit before you in my official capacity as a leader of the state's largest labor union, I'm also here as a 31-year veteran classroom teacher with professional endorsements as a 712 English teacher and a K-12 reading specialist.
Great.
I'll begin my prepared remarks by applauding your committee for bringing a focus upon literacy in our schools. The fundamental reading skills of our students determine the level of their success in school and throughout their lives. If our students do not learn to read in their early years, they cannot read to learn in their later years. Academic learning depends upon one's literacy skills. In other words, the ability to read is the foundation and the predictor of a child's success, not just as a student, but as a citizen. While literacy is the responsibility of the entire education community, from the school board to the superintendent, to the principal, to the classroom teacher, to the librarian, to the paraeducator providing one-on-one services, to the counselor assisting students select their courses, I caution against legislative language that mandates attaching literacy outcomes to a superintendent's job performance. In part, the multiple variables that will determine district outcomes make it an unfair element of the superintendent's evaluation. And perhaps just as importantly, it requires an inordinate amount of data collection to reach a definitive conclusion about a single administrator's performance. Our professional educators need to focus on providing direct instruction in this critical area, not spend their time with data collection. The field of literacy is dynamic and continues to evolve with new discoveries in neuroscience, psychology, and the specific cognitive science of learning. Our colleges and universities that prepare teachers are engaged in the ongoing development of this important field. The accreditation of teacher preparation programs is the responsibility of the Vermont Standards Board for Professional Educators. So it is certainly appropriate for legislators to request that the Standards Board review teacher preparation programs through the lens of literacy instruction. As the former chair of the Standards Board, I can assure you that the preparation programs are under regular review. The Vermont Standards Board for Professional Educators is also the body which determines the standards and requirements for teacher licensure in the state of Vermont. It appears that the intent of this legislation is to request that the Standards Board review the standards for licensure, particularly in the endorsement areas of special education, and to add coursework that specifically addresses literacy. As a graduate of UVM's teacher preparation program in the 1980s, I was required to have 6 credit hours in reading before receiving my teaching credentials in secondary English. The endorsement as a reading specialist required an additional 18 credit hours. We agree with your premise that it is unfair and ineffective to expect special educators to teach reading if they have not been trained to teach reading. I do not know how many public tax dollars were spent in hiring the district management group in 2017, but many of us in the field of reading could have provided you with the same conclusions this private consulting firm provided. In the 1990s, we saw a dramatic and documented reduction of special education referrals in schools that implemented reading recovery in first grade. If we do not provide effective reading instruction to struggling readers, which is what reading recovery and other one-on-one programs do, then they will most likely be diagnosed with a learning disability and placed on an IEP. Something that can be avoided with proper intervention and direct literacy instruction in the early grades. If there is one thing that we learned through the painful years of the No Child Left Behind's test and punish approach, it's that students do not learn how to read by being forced to take standardized tests. Educators know that the standardized tests you reference in this bill do nothing in assessing an individual student's needs. They are designed to assess an entire district's program of learning and should not be the focus of a teacher's time and energy. Teachers need the time and resources to qualitatively assess their students individually to determine what instructional approaches will work. Standardized tests have a narrow focus on a very small set of skills, and we must analyze the results cautiously. As former Vermont Commissioner of Education Mark Hull used to say, administering a standardized test is the equivalent of checking your engine's oil level with a dipstick. It is only one measure that cannot assess the entire engine's performance. To be even more specific, I want to go on record as requesting that you strike lines 19 and 20 on page 2 and lines 1 and 2 on page 3. All Vermonters are aware of the adverse effects of COVID-19 pandemic on people of all ages, but we need to avoid dramatic statements that imply this pandemic has damaged students' development to the point that they will suffer for years to come. I appreciate the concern expressed in this type of statement, but we must acknowledge the resilience of our children and youth, as well as respect our educators' ability to help their students heal from the pandemic and to complete the unfinished learning of the last year. Statements of this nature do not acknowledge, respect, nor appreciate the tireless efforts of Vermont educators, as well as the efforts of our students' families in providing the best education possible to their students during this wretched pandemic. Whether meeting their students in person or engaging with them virtually, educators have been doing their best in addressing all academic areas, including reading and writing. Educators need time and resources to continue to assess their students and determine their needs for future instruction. Our educators report that they have been amazed at how much their students are learning through the pandemic, particularly in the area of executive functioning skills like time management and personal initiative. We must be extremely careful to avoid any punitive measures for students and their families as we work collectively to prepare our students for new opportunities and possibilities. We ask that you reconsider the demands this legislation would place on school districts and the children they serve. While assessment of pre-K and kindergarten students is important, many reading experts argue that standardized assessment should not be administered at these young ages, as you just heard in most recent testimony. I would also caution against the use of the term dyslexia, implying that it is a specific diagnosis. Dyslexia is a term used to describe a multitude of learning disorders that a struggling reader may experience while acquiring literacy skills. All effective interventions must be tailored for each student's individual needs. This takes time, as well as a sophisticated skill set on the part of the teacher. The phrase science-based literacy should also be struck from the bill because it implies a prescriptive or rigid formulaic approach to many educators. I would suggest the term balanced literacy. In closing, I will return to my opening remarks. We appreciate and respect your committee's focus on student literacy, a complex issue which requires ongoing study, ongoing professional development for the field, and ongoing resources to support our efforts in making sure every Vermont student is a strong reader. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Committee questions. I'll just also kick it off. So what would you recommend, Mr. Tinney, happens going forward to make improvements in literacy rates?
Well, I think, Senator,
Just
would-
what you ask the other, our other witnesses.
right. I mean, I think I would begin with the conversation you started in terms of what are the test results showing? And do we need to start with, I think, a really good picture of just where our students are in terms of literacy? And before we move forward, it's as Superintendent Bonesteel said, her son with his SBAC scores do not indicate what his skills are. So I think that's where we begin is a different form of assessment, and ask all educators, are your students reading? If not, why is that? And I think depending on all the factors that are part of that picture, I think where do you begin, right? I mean, do you begin with third grade and fourth grade? And that's a different question as opposed to the other question about the number of students who graduate compared to the number of students who have success at college, right? Which is another piece. So I think it's important that we number one, focus on literacy, which is important, but are we allowing the time to do the work that's necessary is another question.
So, okay.
But again, how do we define the problem? Like, what is the problem? And if we're determining that we have a problem based on SBAC scores, then let's begin looking at what that SBAC score actually says.
All right. Well, maybe here's a way to start. You've been an expert in this for a long time. Do you believe we have a problem?
Yes, I believe that we have to address literacy. There's no doubt. And one of for me, my most recent experiences were as a high school English teacher.
Yeah.
And I would say that yes, we have to address the problem. And in some cases with older students, is the problem around literacy skills, or is the problem around work ethic, commitment to actually reading the work? And that's another issue. We found that in a survey we did a couple of years ago of our members, about 85% of our members have noticed a decline in work ethic amongst their students. Now, that's not to blame students, it's just what has been happening.
Well, if you're arriving at high school and if you're not equipped to do the kinds of readings we just heard about, I would say that could be quite discouraging and therefore lead to students dropping. I mean, we see this all the time. I think we all can point to personal experiences.
Right, and I think in terms of what to do, maybe Libby addressed this. What are the assessments we're using as eighth graders are leaving, right? And wherever you have that transition point, we need some authentic assessments so we as educators really know where our students are. And that is not a statewide score to report as much as it is for the educator who's going to work with those students. Do they know where they are, and do we have the time and the resources to do that?
Senator Terenzini.
Thank you, Senator Campion. Mr. Tinney, a couple quick questions. I think in the beginning of your presentation, you said that it would be unfair to correct me if I'm wrong, it would be unfair to hold the superintendent accountable for literacy rates. Is that what you said?
Yeah, I think it's in terms of deciding if I was reacting to just the basic statement there that somehow we have to have the superintendent, his job performance or her job performance is based on the literacy rate. All the things that Superintendent Bonesteel addressed, given all the variables there, it would be unfortunate to have that be is the superintendent doing a good job or a bad job based on based on test scores.
So I guess a follow up to that, and I don't know the answer. I'm not being sarcastic. I'm in a performance based job. If I don't perform and hit performance indicators, I probably lose my job. Or if the voters of Rutland County don't think that I'm doing a good job as senator, I could lose my Senate seat in 2 years when they elect someone else. So to that point, I just don't know if literacy rates don't go up and we don't see more success stories. Who do you hold accountable for that performance? And I'm not singling out that it is a superintendent because I don't know the answer. I'm just trying to look to you as an expert.
Right. And I think it goes to the accountability question. It's not saying no one is accountable, but I think it also is a case of, how do we hold ourselves accountable? Ultimately, we're most accountable to our students. If we fail them, we've failed. And I guess the question is, how is the district doing? And I get you take the person at the very top. When the team does poorly, you fire the general manager, right? That kind of idea. But I think we have to be careful in education because those performance-based standards that we use in the corporate world don't directly apply to the education world. And part of that is because we know, for instance, as Senator Campion talked about Barack Obama's view that the difference a teacher can make in the life of a child, it's important to know that in a school, right, the most significant person in the child's school life is the teacher. But then there's life outside of school that has a direct impact. So, I'm just concerned that my main concern is you say, here are the reading scores, they went down, you're not rehired. That's the bottom line there. And I think we have to be very careful at taking that type of approach.
Other questions? Senator Chittenden.
I guess just to as a husband of a public school teacher, I would just say there's so many more things than just what the teacher does that factors into the literacy results. So I am completely supportive of the notion of holding people accountable in their performance, but to put it all on the teacher would neglect all the important roles of the parent, the community. It takes a village, and everybody that is a part of that child's life to motivate them to learn. So to your point, Senator Terenzino, I'm not against having measures in place so that teachers know how to how they will be evaluated. But I would be hesitant to lay all the performance of our students entirely at their feet when so many factors, socioeconomic factors, contribute to the challenge of literacy.
So, Mr. Tinney, as we're looking, at this issue, how would you direct us to get at this issue? How do we look back in a decade and say, all right, this committee took a few steps. These were the 3 steps that Don Tinney told us to take, and look at it has made a huge difference. Help us out.
Sure. I think one critical piece here is to look at the size of our classes. And we know, for instance, that if we're talking about a specialized class to bring students back up, sort of raising their reading performances, you don't want more than 6, right? In a mediated instruction environment with students who are struggling with readers. Do we have? It's a workforce question, right? Do we have the enough reading specialists to meet the needs of these struggling readers? And that is, our workforce questions are huge right now. It's not like we have hundreds of teachers knocking on the schoolhouse door, and there are very few certified reading specialists in the state. And I think that's a piece to really look at, is if we however we screen our younger students, as soon as there's an issue identified, then what do? Do we have the specialists available to provide the mediated instruction that they need? So the size of the classes is critical in the early years. I also would point out that one of the brighter spots of the pandemic has been with a hybrid model, which has been a incredibly difficult system for our members to teach in. But the one piece they do have enjoyed was earlier in the year having half the number of students in their classes at one time, because they got to know their students much more effectively than having a full classroom. So I think we need to look at that and say, does that matter? Are we expecting to, having 20 students in the elementary classroom, can you get to every student, who, particularly those who are struggling as readers? Now that's a huge resource question too, but that's a big piece of it.
Would the research support what you're saying around classroom size? I mean, I continue to be amazed at the research. The investment really, we invest in the teacher. The talented teacher can do so much with 10, 15, 20 students.
Right.
But you're saying really what we should do is cut the class size.
Right. So class size plays a role, and a significant role, when the class size changes the student behavior.
Uh-huh.
Right. So if I have, again, my perspective, a high school teacher, if I have 16 students, right, I take a certain approach. If I have 28 students, right, now the amount of time that I'm going to have to provide effective feedback on their writing, for instance, the number of times I can have a one-on-one conversation in a class discussion with those students, that changes as a result. So there are certain practices as a reading teacher that I cannot really do if I have a large class, that I can do, right? The ideal is the one-on-one. The best way we know how to teach reading is shoulder to shoulder with a student. And that's what a reading recovery program does. That's why people who can afford it will hire a tutor, right, to work with their student one-on-one. I think one of the things that we need to do is, how can we incorporate more one-on-one time between teacher and student in our public classrooms? But again, that becomes a very expensive proposition. Hardly anyone ever questioned the efficacy of the reading recovery program, but it was an expensive program. And when you have one teacher who will work with 4 students per day, if it's, that's sort of the standard, and then they do other things in the, say in the afternoon, it's a very expensive process. But I do think we need to consider that, one of many. So, and I think you had, the 2 witnesses before I came on, offered some ideas as well, and this needs to have a continued this conversation.
Yeah,
I don't have all the answers for that, but
Sure.
but collectively we will.
Yeah, I agree. Senator Hooker, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Tinney. A couple of things. We're all concerned about, what the pandemic has done, and you've pointed that out. And I know that, there's been some concern that kids need to be caught up, but I'm glad you pointed out that some of these kids are really blossoming. They're really flowering, in this environment. But what recommendations would you have for those kids who haven't been as fortunate during the pandemic?
Right. I think you raise an excellent point, that we cannot afford to send a message of, you've got to get back up to grade level, right? That's the conversation that becomes punitive. And, I would wait for the student to say, what do you mean by grade level? What does that even mean, right? I think one of the things that we need to do, and this will need to happen from now through the end of this school year, perhaps over the summer, if there's a summer camp for some kids, and certainly beginning of next year, is having the time to do the qualitative assessment, so teachers know which kids need the most help and which kids have blossomed and don't. I mean, this sort of, blanket statement that all of them are behind and they all need it's just not true. So it begins with that qualitative assessment. Do we have the time to do that? And in terms of professional development, are there issues of assessment literacy for some educators that they need to figure out just how to do that? Because it's part of what teachers do all the time, but right now, is there something else that we need to be looking for? This is certainly true in the social emotional realm as well. We have to pay attention to the social emotional experiences, the trauma these students have experienced. That doesn't mean that all kids are coming back having been affected by trauma. Probably at least a third, though, will need to have some sort of support as they return.
And did I lose my train of thought? What about, I mean, the issues that we're talking about around literacy predate the pandemic.
Absolutely.
And so what suggestion would you have for assessments? I mean, we've talked a little bit about an assessment for dyslexia, and I'm learning more about that and thinking differently about it as we hear testimony. But what kind of assessment, where do you see an assessment would be valuable? Can we start, very young? What, I know that we've heard that certain assessments are not even in place for kids who are
Right.
younger than third grade. What recommendations would you give for?
I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is that the educator in the classroom is the expert, right? And they need to have the opportunity to get to know their students, and through that process to have what we call qualitative assessment, not something that you check a box on a standardized form or whatever, but there could be a checklist of what are the areas that you have assessed. And so, I think sometimes we think too much about assessment as coming up with a number for like either the entire class or for the school. And I think particularly with our younger students, it's important that, and here, this goes back to class size. I can do this with a manageable, smaller group. How do I know my students? Do I know what each student needs? Where are they? When we do it, we used to go, I have enough gray hair to be able to say, well, in my day. So when I first started in my day, we call the qualitative reading inventory, but it takes a fair bit of time to do that. But if you have a student who has been identified as a struggling reader, then it takes that reading specialist opportunity to go through and try to pinpoint what the exact problems are. But I really want to caution us against this standardized benchmark approach, which may give us some numbers that may, have some kind of valid assessment of the entire program, or maybe not. That's the problem with the SBAC. Teachers give the SBAC, but then they don't even get the results in time to inform their practice for that group of students.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, this is a little frustrating. Let's say the 50% number that we keep hearing is off. All right, I'll give you, let's say there's 30% of third graders that aren't reading at grade level. Mm-hmm. What do you say to those parents, Mr. Tinney? What do you say to those kids? I mean, I feel like you're talking about, yeah, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that, but if you're a parent and you have third graders, 30% of the kids who graduate, in third grade aren't reading at grade level, you're not giving us much in the way of assistance if you're just saying we shouldn't evaluate and class size should be smaller.
Well, I think we need to start with am I talking to the individual parent of an individual student, or am I talking to a whole community of folks who want to know the results of a test score? I think that's a different experience. So, I think that, working, let's say if I'm talking to a single parent, we need to look at how is their child doing, right? And that's a different question from what's going on in the whole state. I'm not.
Right, we're policy makers, so our job is to give tools to help people be successful, but we're also, part of our job is, we want to make certain we're going to be held accountable. Secretary of Education, we all should be held accountable.
Absolutely.
If kids are not reading, let's say again, a third of our students aren't reading at grade level. We're seeing this play out, I think, in their lives through the other conversations we've had in this committee with the state colleges, with principals, with superintendents, with others. So So I guess what I'm looking for is, are some ideas, something besides we can't.
Well, no, I think you're on the right track with a focus of pre-K to 3. I think it's critical. I think that my concern is the sort of prescription, right, or a standardized approach. That's because we know that those do not work as effectively as some people would like us to believe. There's a whole national effort. They go around to every state legislature. The Senate bill from a couple of years ago in Arkansas looks pretty much exactly like the bill that we're talking about right now. And it's sort of the dyslexia folks version of ALEC, and they've gone and shopped this around. And I think that it's important to understand that it's not a standardized approach that's going to work. It's important that we focus on individual students and their needs, and how we do that is personalized, humanized, and when there is a problem, when there is a struggling reader, do we have the resources and the interventions available to make sure we bring that student up to the grade level, as we say, instead of saying, oh, well, maybe they'll get it next year, or maybe somebody in the middle school will connect with them. That's one of the things that's important, that we have to be, and I'm not in any way suggesting retaining students, but if we identify with whatever the assessment is that this student is a struggling reader, then are the resources going to be there? If I'm a classroom teacher and I've identified a struggling reader, what do? If I don't have a reading specialist or another person to do the intervention next door or down the hall, what happens? And that is an enormous resource question, because what has happened, and I'm only speaking from my personal experience as a classroom teacher. What I've seen happen is that, well, here's a struggling reader, and rather than really teaching that student to read, they end up in the system getting referred to special ed. They get on an IEP, and maybe they'll get the reading instruction they need, or maybe someone else will make all kinds of accommodations and modifications in their classroom so the student doesn't have to read. And that's another problem. I remember when I was working in the reading lab at UVM, and I have to be careful here. I don't want to disclose any identities, but I essentially followed a student through his entire day. A student that I was working with in my reading class, followed him during the day. And what struck me was how many times, or I should say how few times, he was expected to read during his class day. He had been in classes, one teacher said, well, this is a tech class. I don't want to ask the kids to read too much because I know they struggle with it. And we have to look at, that kind of approach. Are we in all great intentions, right? Excellent intentions to try to support students and make them feel comfortable. We've taken away that sort of expectation because we know, as you've pointed out, they may not have the skills. So that's where if we're going to focus on K3 as we should, we have to make sure that the interventionists, that the specialized instruction is available to them, and not just think, well, here's another worksheet, So I hope that answers your question.
That's helpful. Senator Terenzini and then Senator Hooker.
One question and then one comment. Mr. Tinney, do all schools, or at least school districts in Vermont, have a dedicated reading interventionist?
No, there are very few actually who would be in the certification I got years ago as a reading specialist. Most of those folks are in special education now. And I think that's one of the things to look. There are a number of literacy coaches who are doing work in schools. But I think I know, for instance, the St. Albans Town Education Center has a phenomenal program with a number of certified reading specialists. If you're looking for a model, they are excellent, but that's not every school. And usually in high schools, they have hardly anyone to do reading interventions. So.
And if I may, a comment you made earlier saying that, we shouldn't make a blanket statement about students and that just because of COVID that we're going to have big problems with where they're at right now in their educational process and so on. But I respectfully appreciate your positivity on that, but I speak from as a parent who talked to a lot of other parents. I have a third grader and a kindergartner right now in what I would say, and I'm biased, but I would say one of the best schools in Vermont with some of the best teachers in Vermont. And my wife and I are concerned about, their advancement to the next grade because of this last year, and no fault of a teacher or a school. It's because of COVID. But I think that I think it's too early for us to predict what type of long-term damage COVID has done to these young elementary school kids in a lot of cases.
I absolutely agree, but it also, like you say, it's too early to predict. We haven't done the assessments that we'll need to do for that, and absolutely, their kids have a lot of work to do, sort of to get where they need to be. But my concern is sort of the despair that we're hearing in the public sphere, right? And a headline the other day was, referring to our students as the lost generation. That's the sort of thing I consider as extreme. I think it's going to take 2 or 3 or 4 years for students to get to where they would have been had this not happened. But I just don't, and it's not just optimism, it's just that we know the dangers of despair. The loss of hope for children as well as adults has negative impacts on our health. And I think we have to remember, you're right. You're going to struggle with this. You're going to struggle going in the 4th grade. Think of all the students who are struggling to get through, French 1 this year. French 2 is not going to look the same as it has done historically, because that French 2 teacher is going to know that the French 1 kids didn't get to where they should have been. So no, I'm sorry if I have implied that it's not a problem. It definitely is, but I do think we need to avoid the despair that comes with that. There's plenty of despair to go around, but to also work with students, say, no, you can learn this. You just, you're not where you're not where your older brother was last year or the year before. But I think but we'll get there, right? We'll get there.
Senator Hooker.
And I think that kids will, as you said, Mr. Tenney, they're resilient, and so many of them will move ahead quickly. But to Senator Campion's point about, what do we tell the parents and what do we give the parents for tools? Do you have any recommendations on, how we can engage the parents in helping with this situation? I mean, we're talking a lot about training teachers and training reading specialists. And, we know that kids who are read to get a jump start on school when they enter into kindergarten. How can we help parents know what can we offer them to help them to prepare their kids?
It's a great question, and I was involved a number of years ago with a program that's out of Australia, and I think it was Education or Literacy Partners and Parents or something like that, where it was designed to do just that. It was designed of all levels to have parents come into school. Of course, we're not doing that right now, but and to talk about literacy. What are some things that people can do at home with their students? I think one of the things I hope that will come out of this pandemic is perhaps a renewed parent-school partnership. And because I think what's important is that parents understand that educators are there and will be there for their students, that and we should be in the role of the support supportive educator, not the one who's saying, you've got to get your kid up to speed here. You've got, and that's why I talk about the sort of the punitive approach. I think we could probably explore these other programs in terms of parent partnerships with education. It's been years since I've looked at that work, but I think I don't know of in the state where we have that happening. I worked on this for 1 year when I first started at BFA, so had mixed results, but it's tough to bring high school parents in. Sometimes they're like, no, my kid's enough, he's independent, he'll be fine.
Maybe we could take a road trip, Senator Campion.
Well, I think it's
Australia.
an opportunity. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that we could do. I think there's a lot of opportunities that if maybe the summer will allow that to happen. I think district by district. I don't know if we want to mandate something from the state, but I do think that in this area, why not be more creative about how we support our students and their families, that it's not all happening at home, but also don't want to get into the you need to work harder on your homework kind of approach either.
Yeah. So one of the big takeaways for me from this conversation is, if we can give, as we're crafting a bill here, strong instructional coaching, kind of in every district, or have more access to that kind of a resource would certainly be helpful.
Yes. And I think, and I don't, I know you do want to hesitate, refer to a study committee, right? But I do think we have to figure out what resources are needed, right? And that depends on the school, but as Superintendent Bonesteel pointed out, she has amazing schools in her district, but she still sees there's a ways to go here. Sure. And how do we come up with a plan that we can find the resources that are necessary? And I want to echo what she said about the sustainability of the program, that we've made adjustments to in our professional development, that we're doing this with social emotional issues. We know that one workshop doesn't work. We have to figure out a way to shift the mindset of the education workforce over time, and it requires collaboration with educators and administrators, and I would include in many ways parents. How do we sustain our efforts? So it's not and that's a lot of work, and it requires a real commitment, and I don't know how one legislates that. I mean, that's for me, I have great respect for the work you're doing, because you're trying to distill all of these needs, right, of all of our society and all our kids, and distill that into a piece of legislation. And you have my admiration, and please hurry up and get it done. No. and find the money for every idea that you have.
Well, I think we recognize, and I think you would agree, business as usual isn't working. So if business as usual isn't working, what can we be doing as a legislature, to legislators in this committee in particular, to support the work out there, those in the classroom, those that might be coming up in the classroom, and to help, because we can't keep this going, can't keep this situation going.
Right, and
I mean, if I were a parent and I had a first grader, I'd be telling the committee exactly what you just said: get going.
Well, right, and I think what's really important is the parent. If you're the parent of that first grader, mm-hmm. that you're in conversations with the first grade teacher, and to find out what supports are available. And that goes back to Senator Hooker's question about, well, what are we asking our parents to do? What is the communication between school and families? I think that's a critical piece, because I think there is a disconnect sometimes between what our individual educators and the individual student experience is and what the numbers say in press reports about it. So I think that I think we have to look carefully at how we define the problem. Don't hear that please as saying there's not a problem. You know, our members see that, right? And they want to make sure that we better serve our students, that we're always about improving our practice. And now this is an opportunity to focus on beginning with K3. I mean, there's a whole lot of other issues, and you talked about the 0 to 5 group. And I think I may have mentioned in this committee or other committees, you know, the VSAC study that showed about 85% of boys who are on free and reduced lunches, they go on to virtually no post-secondary training whatsoever. So if we have 85% of our boys in poverty not going on to any post-secondary training, no community college, no technical school, no four-year college, there's a place you could also start. Why is that? Why do they feel that they are not able to, right? Does that start in kindergarten and first grade? And I guarantee you, a student who is not reading at the third, reading proficiently in grade 3 or grade 4 is going to face academic failure for the remainder of their school years, and will most likely not have any intention to continue their training or further education. So the stakes are incredibly high here.
Yeah.
And I think that we definitely need to continue this work again, to do the work to find out just what is the problem, and what is, you know, is there a specific group? It's not all about poverty. There are other issues, right? We studied our standardized test scores one year, and you know, the not meeting the standard, exceeding the standard, right? You have that spectrum. And we said, my goodness, look at, and this was one school district, but look at all the kids who are in the didn't meet the standard who are in free and reduced lunch. We say, wow. But then guess what? It was almost the same number of students on free and reduced lunch who are in the exceeding the standard. So if we just exceeding.
Yeah.
So it's not, you know, just because someone's grown up in poverty does not mean that they're not capable.
Well, that's what I think Obama's quote in part said. I mean, you know, we have to give credit where credit is due. If you've got a teacher in the front of that classroom, and the research seems to show this over and over again, that if you have a talented teacher, that teacher can really not possibly wipe out, but it really diminishes the negative roles.
Absolutely.
Poverty and all of those issues that come into the classroom have. It is absolutely startling looking at some of this information.
No, I absolutely agree. And it's why important that we have to retain those good teachers, and we have to make sure those good teachers have the resources that they need. And, you know, I absolutely agree. And many of our, if not all of our members, serve that role at various points of their career, but the majority of our educators, the vast majority of our educators, are that teacher, right? I mean, excuse the grammar of that sentence, but I mean, our teachers are making a remarkable difference. And, you know, need to continue that work as long as they're supported in that work.
Absolutely.
And it's tough when you have, you know, I mean, we really can't make any real conclusions right now on anything, because we're all dealing with the chronic unpredictability of this pandemic.
Yeah.
But where we go from here, I think, is really clear that we talk a lot about assessment of our students. I think we have to assess the entire system here in terms, and not from a test score point of view, but let's start with what's working.
Yeah. No, I think finding out what's working is a great essential component to this. Where are things working? Where are things not working? And whatever is working, what are the kinds of things that we can duplicate and share with others and get out there? But I would still say a parent a teacher, a community member, a state needs to have an evaluation process. You have to be able to say, it's not going to nail every kid, you know, and get everybody right, but you have to have some kind of testing that is going to at least give people a sense of the direction and how generally, you know, general data on how the state is
Right.
doing.
Right. And it's as long as everyone's clear about what is in fact being tested.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's the critical piece. And that and to not use that as somehow thinking, oh, I know what this one particular kid needs because of this SBAC score.
Right. Yeah.
And they keep it in place. This is and to try to keep the testing as perspective is the challenge.
Yeah. I thank you. I think this has been
Okay.
an incredibly valuable conversation.
And I'm very glad you had the articulate witnesses before I came on. So that
you too. The only thing I guess the only thing I'm hoping that you'll do is just continue to think about this, Don. And I'm serious when I said to our two prior witnesses, Libby and Chelsea, we're looking for partners. We're looking for people. We're looking for the things that can really help, make a change. And there are just some things, there's some things we can't do, but there are some things that the legislature certainly can do. And business as usual isn't working, as I've said, and believe that. And so that's not only true in this state, but a lot of states, and we have to do better, and we will do better. And I think the only way we'll get there, though, is people like you and our prior two witnesses really, really partner with us and send us some ideas in the next few days as we start to draft a piece of legislation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you. So, committee, what would you like to do with this? I think this will probably be our last topic for the day, given that it went a while. I for one, found it incredibly valuable, and also really meant it, and I think everybody else did, partnering particularly. I mean, I think Don would be a good partner as well, but our first two witnesses there, both Chelsea and Libby, seem to be a wealth of knowledge. Both are really on the ground in different ways, but certainly seem to have a pulse of what's happening out there and how we can be helpful. So, I mean, my instincts are we take what they give us and start to look at it more seriously in committee. Senator Perschlick.
Kind of like I said in my question comment to them is, as citizen legislators, trying to take their ideas and into legislative language is difficult. So
yeah,
I think we gave them a timeline for some suggestions. Then we could give those in legislative language. Jim can do that for us. But if they can give us some specifics of what they'd like to see, then I think they would. It sounded like they were willing to do that. And
I think they seemed excited and willing to do that. And I'll loop back to them and see what their timing looks like. I think they both, in general, had an idea that they just would need to kind of put on paper and share with us.
I think Chelsea actually made some.
She did.
Yeah, and no, but after the testimony today, she may want to change that or improve it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I already sent an email to Superintendent Bonesteel, since she's the superintendent.
Great. A complicated yet incredibly important thing, and it's just interesting to me. I'll send you all what I was sent, the New York Times piece, if you haven't seen it, where Mississippi is going gangbusters in literacy, and their numbers are going up. And of course, it's a Times article. But then I have, some stuff about Massachusetts also. So I think there are some things out there that we could share with Chelsea and Libby to also just get their thoughts on, like, is what we're reading, what we're seeing in some of these other states. Are these models? Are there ideas within these that we should duplicate? I, for one, believe that education has been, and feel free to disagree, researched backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. The information is out there. Sometimes I think what needs to happen in our universities and legislatures and other spots is that research is curated and gotten to policymakers a little bit better. But I do feel like there is a lot out there that we just need that we can use. And I think certainly Chelsea and Libby in particular probably have a good handle on that. And again, as you said, Senator Perchlik, given us citizens legislature, can help us navigate that. Please, Senator Perchlik.
At least what I found from my first 2 years on the committee is that the academics don't always agree. So we were kind of like you referenced when we had that earlier testimony from the professor from Harvard and stuff about the reading wars. There's tons of research in both of them, kind of like the group that has the dyslexia bill. They also have a bunch of research of saying why we need to do the screening, for example. But then what we heard from today was like, we'd have a lot of concerns about screening. So that's kind of where it comes down to our job. I see as parsing these different experts that want to.
Yeah.
I don't know if I misunderstood, but I didn't see that they were opposed to screening as opposed to screening for a specific disability and putting, labels on kids early on. So screening for reading, struggling kids who are struggling, trying to figure out what their problems are is I think what Mr. Tinney was referring to as well.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. That's what I meant.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think we've all heard from the Dyslexia Association. I know there's a constituent in my district who has a daughter with dyslexia, and there is this movement out there. And I know Senator Terenzini is looking at it, and I know Senator Cummings has looked at this issue in the past. So it'll be interesting to kind of dig in and learn more. Senator Chittenden, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say to attest to Senator Perchlik's statement, academics very often don't agree. It's quite par for the course. They love to disagree.
Yeah, right.
Only they do agree completely on climate change. So there's no argument there.
Point taken, Senator Lyon.
And I have a feeling there's something we're going to find that there's some agreement around literacy. It's just a hunch, but I think there's a lot of agreement out there on how we can advance things. Okay, I appreciate this very much. Hope everybody has a good evening, and unless there's anything else right now, we'll adjourn for the day. Okay.